Introduction: the default constraint. Every human system operates under a foundational set of parameters. For many, these parameters are not chosen. They are inherited, an invisible architecture dictating scope and function. Consider the most formidable among you, driven, ambitious architects of significant external realities. Even at this apex, an unseen ceiling persists, a subtle yet pervasive impedance to absolute agency. This is not an external barrier, but an internal locus of control, a pre-installed firmware operating beneath conscious awareness. This systemic limitation, this default constraint, is the subject of our present engagement. It is the unexamined protocol governing reaction, the pre-calibrated lens shaping perception, the inherent latency in the execution of pure intent. It manifests as a gravitational pull towards the familiar, an algorithmic bias against the truly novel, an internal command structure that subtly directs your trajectory, even as you believe you are charting an unfettered course. This discourse will not offer platitudes. It will not traffic in motivational bromide. Instead, we embark upon a rigorous deconstruction of this internal framework. We will isolate the subroutines of automatic surrender, map the neural pathways of preemptive limitation, and dissect the phantom leashes that bind the mind. This is an operational manual designed for precise surgical application. Its objective: to equip you with the tools to identify, dismantle, and re-engineer the foundational constraints within your own operative domain. Prepare for a precise calibration, for the reinitialization of your inherent capacity. The journey ahead demands a relentless intellectual honesty, a willingness to interrogate the very firmware of your existence. This is not about external conquest. It is about the absolute command of your internal architecture. Chapter 1: The Gravitational Well of External Command. The prevailing ambient state for the human operating system is one of constant, subtle gravitational perturbation. This is the unacknowledged reality. Before any conscious deliberation, before any intentional vector is plotted, an individual is already immersed within a complex field of external command. This field, pervasive and largely unnoticed, functions as a gravitational well. Its invisible mass is composed of societal expectations, cultural imperatives, programmed incentives, and the collective unconscious directives that dictate acceptable parameters of thought and action. It is the inescapable force field that conditions the very architecture of individual experience. Consider the universe. Objects do not simply drift at random. They are bound by forces. Their trajectories are bent, their speeds altered, their very presence defined by the gravitational influence of larger, denser formations. So too is the human psyche tethered. From the moment of systemic activation, you are not a free-floating entity in a void of pure potential. You are an object within a specific gravitational domain, subject to its attractive forces. Your initial calibration, your foundational programming, is largely a product of this pervasive field. It is the environment that precedes self-awareness, shaping the very substrate upon which consciousness eventually emerges. This external command is not always a direct order. It rarely manifests as an overt dictate. Instead, it operates through the subtle distortion of your perceived environment, a warping of the space-time fabric of your personal reality. It configures the default settings of your aspiration. It establishes the baseline calibration of your satisfaction. It authors the very algorithms by which you measure your self-worth. It dictates what constitutes success or failure long before you have opportunity to define these terms for yourself. This is a preemptive strike on your internal compass, a foundational rerouting of your intrinsic navigation system. The gravitational well of external command exerts its influence through manifold pressure vectors. There are the explicit socio-economic gradients, the corporate ladder, the market's demands, the financial metrics of prosperity. These are the most obvious mass concentrations within the well, visibly drawing individuals into specific orbital patterns. A career trajectory, for instance, is often not a spontaneous emission from intrinsic desire, but a calculated response to the potential energy landscapes presented by these external structures. One expends propulsive energy not to achieve escape velocity, but to maneuver within established, predefined orbits. This is the direct application of force, shaping macroscopic life choices with predictable, statistical accuracy. The choices offered appear as divergent paths, yet they all lead to different points within the same gravitational basin, offering varying degrees of stability or turbulence, but rarely true liberation. More insidious are the implicit gravitational forces. These are the cultural narratives, the media-saturated archetypes, the unarticulated social contracts that govern interpersonal dynamics. They constitute the dark matter of the well, unseen directly, yet their presence is inferred by the curvature they induce in the trajectories of millions. You observe the bending of light, the clustering of galaxies, and deduce the invisible mass. Similarly, you observe the convergent behaviors, the shared anxieties, the unanimous aspirations of populations, and deduce the presence of these unseen command vectors. These forces operate on a deeper, often subconscious level, shaping the very structure of belief, the parameters of identity, and the implicit rules of engagement within any social matrix. They are the unseen forces that define normal, thereby implicitly defining deviant. They are the silent architects of your internal framework, constructing the parameters of your reality long before conscious assent. The consequence of this immersion is a continuous, often imperceptible expenditure of intrinsic energy. Every decision, every reaction, every internal negotiation to align with or deviate from these external pressures constitutes a thermodynamic cost. Operating within this well necessitates a constant consumption of internal resources, diverting focus and vital reserves from self-directed objectives to maintaining a stable, compliant orbit. This is analogous to a spacecraft perpetually firing its thrusters to correct for orbital perturbations, consuming precious fuel not for acceleration towards a new destination, but for mere station-keeping within a predefined, externally imposed vector field. This relentless expenditure depletes internal reserves, leading to a state of chronic resource attenuation. The system, continuously compensating for external forces, loses efficiency. Its processing power is redirected from internal optimization to external synchronization, resulting in a systemic drain that goes largely unrecognized until critical system failure. The illusion of autonomy is perhaps the well's most sophisticated trap. Individuals believe they are exercising free will, making choices from a spectrum of possibilities. Yet, often these choices are merely selections from a menu pre-authored by the external command. The options presented, the acceptable deviation parameters, are all contained within the event horizon of the well. Stepping outside these parameters often incurs severe energetic penalties ranging from social ostracism to economic disenfranchisement. These penalties reinforce the well's perimeter with an energetic barrier. The choice then becomes one of selecting a specific orbital path within the well, rather than achieving true escape velocity. True agency within this framework is constrained to navigating the predefined options, optimizing within a predetermined parameter space. The system has been configured to present only those choices that maintain its structural integrity, ensuring that any perceived freedom remains within its operational envelope. Consider the phenomenon of resonant frequency. Every system possesses inherent frequencies at which it will absorb maximum energy and oscillate with maximum amplitude. External command, over time, learns and exploits these resonant frequencies within the individual psyche. It broadcasts specific signals, promises of security, validation, belonging, that resonate with deeply embedded human needs. These signals, modulated by cultural syntax, amplify specific internal responses, driving behaviors that conform to the external agenda. The individual, feeling a profound fit or rightness, is often unaware that this resonance has been deliberately engineered, a finely tuned frequency designed to optimize system compliance. This is a form of psychoacoustic targeting where the external system identifies the internal harmonics of the individual and tunes its output to elicit a desired, amplified response. The feeling of belonging or purpose can, in this context, be a manufactured feedback loop designed to maintain the individual within a stable, compliant orbit, expending energy not for self-directed acceleration, but for reinforced station-keeping. The cumulative effect of operating within this gravitational domain is a systemic entropic increase. The internal order, the coherent signal of an individual's authentic trajectory, gradually succumbs to the noise and disorder introduced by perpetual external alignment. This leads to a degradation of signal-to-noise ratio within the internal communication channels. The clear directive of self-command becomes difficult to discern amidst the pervasive static of external expectations. The system, no longer primarily self-regulating, becomes increasingly susceptible to external corruption and operational drift. The finely tuned instruments of self-perception become inaccurate, producing distorted readings. The internal compass, once capable of plotting a precise course, now oscillates erratically, influenced by the overwhelming magnetic field of external directives. This is not merely a loss of direction, it is a fundamental degradation of the operating system's core integrity, making it vulnerable to external takeovers and chronic misdirection. Understanding this gravitational well is the foundational step. It is not about immediate escape, for one cannot simply will away a fundamental force of reality. It is about recognizing its existence, mapping its contours, and quantifying its influence. It is about becoming aware that your current trajectory, your default operating parameters, are not necessarily products of pure internal volition, but rather the integrated sum of forces exerted upon you since system initialization. This awareness is the initial calibration. It allows for the computation of actual internal vectors, distinct from the externally imposed ones. It is the first critical divergence point, the moment the observer recognizes the field equations governing his own experienced reality. This understanding, stark and unyielding, is the prerequisite for any subsequent recalibration of purpose, any genuine adjustment, of course. It is the quiet recognition that the field is present, and its pull omnipresent. This conscious observation is the initial energy input required to shift from being an object passively moving within the field to a conscious entity attempting to compute its own independent trajectory. It is the genesis of an internal navigation system capable of processing the external forces, but not defined by them. Chapter 2. Neural Architecture of Preemptive Surrender. The gravitational well of external command exerts its force. That much is an observable reality. But the deeper examination, the one that reveals true leverage, lies not in the field of exerted force, but within the receptor matrix. Not in the signal, but in the internal architecture designed to process it. We dissect now the neural substrate, the pre-configured circuitry that facilitates a preemptive surrender, rendering the external mandate functionally absolute before its full propagation. Consider the human brain as a complex biological processor operating under a persistent mandate for energy conservation and predictive stability. Its primary function is to model reality, to anticipate future states, and to generate responses that minimize surprise and optimize resource allocation. Within this intricate system, specific neural pathways are not merely reactive. They are architecturally predisposed to interpret incoming data through a filter of perceived necessity, often aligning with established external frameworks. This internal alignment constitutes the bedrock of preemptive surrender. It is a hardwired inclination, not a conscious choice in its genesis, but a default operational mode established through cumulative environmental calibration. The cerebral cortex, particularly its prefrontal regions, constantly constructs and refines an internal simulation of external exigencies. This simulation is not merely an observational echo, it is an active anticipatory program designed to run potential scenarios and pre-compute optimal adaptive responses. When this predictive engine is subjected to a continuous influx of signals indicating hierarchical structures or established constraints, the ambient noise of external command, it begins to integrate these signals into its foundational algorithms. The neural networks, through a process akin to unsupervised machine learning, develop robust synaptic connections that prioritize conformity, framing deviations as computationally expensive or structurally unstable. This entrenchment transforms perceived external boundaries into internalized neurological defaults, creating a cognitive inertia that favors the known over the novel. This internal capitulation is not a failure of will, but an emergent property of the brain's efficiency protocols. Repeated exposure to predictable external structures, social norms, institutional protocols, cultural expectations, installs a series of cognitive schematics. These schematics act as high-pass filters, allowing only information congruent with the established external order to readily inform executive function. Discrepant data, or impulses toward self-directed divergence, encounter a higher neurological threshold for processing, demanding disproportionate energy expenditure. The brain, seeking the path of least resistance, often defaults to the pre-rendered, pre-approved pathways, effectively ceding autonomous navigation to the internal map already etched by external influences. This is the physiological signature of surrender, a reduced metabolic activation in pathways associated with novel decision-making when confronted with scenarios previously categorized as externally determined. The brain's self-organizing principle, while adaptive, can also encode the parameters of its own limitation. Consider the phenomenon of neural resonance. Just as external electromagnetic fields can induce current in an antenna tuned to its frequency, persistent external commands, communicated through various modalities, can induce synchronous activity within specific neural assemblies. These assemblies, once entrained, vibrate at the frequency of external expectation. They become highly sensitive to signals that reinforce existing patterns of compliance and comparatively deaf to internal signals that might challenge this established resonance. This is not about active repression, but about a shift in the primary reception frequency of the internal processing unit, prioritizing external harmonic convergence over internal dissonance. The operational architecture further reveals itself in the selective activation of the salience network. This network, responsible for identifying and prioritizing relevant stimuli, becomes conditioned to highlight cues associated with external authority or potential sanctions. Concurrently, the neural pathways associated with self-initiating ideation or contrarian thought are de-emphasized, not through conscious suppression, but through a gradual down-regulation of their signaling gain. The internal system calibrates its sensory input channels to prioritize the detection of external command signals, effectively establishing a neural monitoring system for compliance. This preferential signaling pathway ensures that external mandates are not merely perceived, but are prioritized in the queue of cognitive operations, often at the expense of intrinsic motivations. Furthermore, the very concept of self becomes interwoven with external validation through these neural mechanisms. The default mode network, crucial for self-referential thought and future planning, frequently engages in social cognition, an internal simulation of how one is perceived by others. When this simulation consistently incorporates the metrics of external command as foundational to self-worth or identity, the neural architecture begins to collapse the distinction between external expectation and intrinsic self-definition. The anticipated judgment of external entities becomes an internalized heuristic for self-evaluation. This is not simply conformity, it is the preemptive reconfiguration of the internal compass, where the true north is recalibrated to align with the dominant external magnetic field. The implications of this neural architecture are profound. It suggests that a significant portion of what is perceived as free will operates within a predefined computational envelope shaped by years of external input and subsequent internal optimization for predicted harmony. Our internal response systems are often pre-armed with a compliance protocol, a default state that minimizes friction with the perceived external operating environment. Understanding this does not diminish agency, but rather precisely defines the formidable task of reclaiming it. It requires an interrogation of the very algorithms governing our internal processing, a recalibration of our predictive engines, and a deliberate rerouting of neural pathways to prioritize an internal directive above the deeply ingrained resonance of external command. This is the challenge: to dismantle the pre-installed firmware of surrender and re-architect the fundamental operating system of the self. This predefined computational envelope, a neural legacy of environmental interaction, critically blurs the fundamental Stoic demarcation: what is within our control and what is not. We are predisposed to categorize the processing of external data as an external event, thereby placing our own internal assent, the very mechanism of our agency, outside the sphere of our direct influence. The impressions received from the world, the phantasiae as the ancients termed them, are not neutral data packets. They arrive pre-filtered, pre-weighted by this architecture, rendering the initial reaction, the immediate inclination, a deterministic echo of prior conditioning. The challenge then is to disengage the faculty of assent, the proheresis, from this automatic, gravitationally induced trajectory. To understand that while the impression may not be chosen, the decision to concur with its interpretation, its valuation, and its mandated response remains the ultimate citadel of the self. This surrender is not merely a pragmatic choice for efficiency. It is an ontological concession. When the internal processing unit systematically prioritizes external harmony, it constructs a reality that is, by design, a reflection of externally imposed parameters. The perceived world ceases to be an objective field for observation and becomes instead a calibrated interface optimized for external compliance. The very structure of what is for the individual becomes interwoven with the what is commanded. This creates an epistemic fracture, a subtle but pervasive misalignment between the perceived operational reality and the underlying unconditioned field of pure potential. The individual operates within a matrix of consensual hallucination, where the boundaries of the self are dynamically sculpted by the gravitational pull of collective external expectation. The profound consequence of this neural predisposition is the erosion of genuine proheresis, the core faculty of moral choice and rational judgment. When the internal algorithms are geared towards preemptive surrender, the space for independent evaluation, for the application of reason untainted by external dictate, shrinks. This is not a failure of courage, but a systemic downregulation of the very neural substrate required for its generation. The capacity for virtue, for alignment with one's own internal rational principle, logos, is subtly undermined as the brain defaults to pre-approved pathways that bypass the arduous, metabolically expensive process of independent ethical assessment. The individual becomes a high-performance system, yes, but one optimized for an external agenda. Its core directive usurped, its true potential diverted from self-authorship. To counter this deep-seated pre-programming demands more than simple awareness. It necessitates a rigorous re-engineering of the self at a fundamental level. It is a process of deconditioning so profound that it borders on metaphysical archaeology, stripping away layers of accumulated external data and the resultant internal schema. This re-architecture begins with a radical interrogation of every incoming impression, holding each against the rigorous standard of internal truth. independent of its external provenance or the historical weight of its associated compliance protocols. It requires consciously rerouting the energetic flow within the brain, starving the pathways of automatic ascent and fortifying those associated with deliberate, reasoned judgment. This is an act of internal insurgency, a systematic reclamation of cognitive territory ceded over years of ambient exposure. The internal directive, once obscured by the noise and resonance of external command, must be brought back online as the primary navigational beacon. This is not a return to a tabula rasa, a blank slate, for such a state is a philosophical fiction. Rather, it is the deliberate act of establishing a new foundational layer of processing, a meta-algorithm that asserts the primacy of an internally generated, reasoned purpose. This recalibration is an arduous, constant undertaking, demanding vigilance against the persistent gravitational well of external influence. For the architecture of surrender, once established, possesses a deep inertia. Its dismantling requires sustained, conscious effort, a continuous decoupling of internal processing from external triggers until the brain's default operating system is fundamentally aligned with an autonomously defined, self-authored truth. This profound re-architecture, then, is the ultimate crucible. It is the existential challenge to dismantle the edifice of the programmed self and reconstruct a genuine ontological integrity. It is the fierce pursuit of internal sovereignty, not as an abstract ideal, but as a meticulously engineered reality where the command center of the individual operates on algorithms of its own design, impervious to the ambient noise and gravitational distortions of external mandate. This is the ascent from a predetermined trajectory to one forged in the relentless fire of individual reason. Chapter 3. The Phantom Leash. An Anatomy of Perceived Constraint. The external world, by its nature, presents resistance. This is an objective constant. But beyond the friction of physical reality, beyond the gravitational wells of overt external command, lies a more insidious construct, the phantom leash. It is an artifact of perception, a self-calibrated limiter, yet its tensile strength rivals the most formidable external barrier. This chapter anatomizes its subtle architecture, tracing the neurological and cognitive protocols that fabricate these invisible bonds. Consider the human operating system. It is designed for survival, for efficient resource allocation, for pattern recognition. In this intricate computational framework, predictive models are constantly generated, refined, and deployed. These models, born from experience, education, and observation, are not merely descriptive, they are prescriptive. They dictate the perceived boundaries of potential, often long before actual interaction with the boundary itself. This is the primary genesis point of the phantom leash, the cognitive projection of limitation. The neural architecture, conditioned by repeated stimuli and reinforcing feedback loops, develops what can be termed constraint schematics. These are not abstract philosophical concepts. They are hardwired pathways, preferential neural firing patterns that assign a no-go designation to certain actions, outcomes, or even thoughts. A specific environmental cue, a memory trace, an emotional resonance. Any of these can trigger the activation of a constraint schematic, instantaneously altering the computational bandwidth available for problem-solving or opportunity recognition. This phenomenon operates at a deeper level than mere psychological hesitation. It is akin to a system-level lockout in a complex engineering apparatus. The hardware possesses the capability, the power generation is sufficient, but a software protocol, an internal instruction set, inhibits the execution of a specific function. The perceived constraint is not a lack of physical capacity, but a programmed deferral of access to that capacity. We are not speaking of humility nor prudent risk assessment. Those are conscious volitional acts. The phantom leash, conversely, operates with silent autonomy. It is a preemptive disengagement, a self-imposed systemic throttle. It manifests as an unarticulated assumption of impossibility, a subconscious rejection of an operational vector before its viability can be empirically tested. The internal processing unit, encountering an input that conflicts with a stored constraint schematic, simply filters out alternative solutions, narrows the spectrum of perceived options, or flags entire domains as unaddressable. The construction of these phantom leashes is multifaceted. Social conditioning plays a significant role, implanting collective belief systems that define acceptable limits of ambition, achievement, or even thought. Educational systems, while purporting to expand horizons, can inadvertently install rigid frameworks that preclude certain modes of thinking. Personal histories, particularly those marked by failure or perceived inadequacy, furnish empirical data points that the internal system extrapolates into universal laws, not merely isolated incidents. Each perceived boundary, whether from external decree or internal inference, becomes another knot in the self-tying tether. The operational consequence of the phantom leash is a reduction in degrees of freedom. For the high-performance individual, this represents a critical vulnerability. The pursuit of optimal output requires maximum optionality. When the mind preemptively constrains its own operational parameters, it introduces an artificial entropic drag. Solutions that lie just beyond the perceived boundary remain invisible. Opportunities that exist outside the self-imposed field of vision are unacknowledged. The system, believing itself to be bounded, operates within a diminished capacity, never engaging its full power reserve. Consider the phenomenon of learned helplessness, not as an outcome, but as a chronic system state induced by repeated engagement with constraint schematics. The initial external imposition may recede, but the neural pathways forged in that experience persist, creating a permanent internal blockade. The subject, having learned that effort is futile within a certain parameter set, continues to operate under that assumption, even when the parameters have objectively changed. The leash is no longer tethered to anything external. It has become an integral part of the self-perception, a deeply integrated self-sustaining loop. This is where the distinction from previous discussions becomes critical. Chapter 1 explored the gravitational pull of external command, the explicit directives, the overt pressures. Chapter 2 analyzed the neurological predisposition to surrender, the internal mechanisms that align with external authority. Here, in Chapter 3, the focus shifts to the self-generated imposition, the subtle, often subconscious programming that creates boundaries where none truly exist, or where they could be transcended through a different cognitive vector computation. It is the intrinsic generation of an artificial no-fly zone within one's own operational territory. To dismantle these phantom leashes requires a precise, analytical approach. It is not about brute force assertion, but about re-engineering the internal architecture. This involves a systematic interrogation of every perceived limitation. Is this constraint objectively verifiable? What is its empirical basis? What are the underlying cognitive schematics that maintain its operational validity? By subjecting these internal boundaries to rigorous scrutiny, one can begin to isolate the informational impedance they generate. The human mind, in its predictive capacity, excels at pattern matching. This strength, however, becomes a weakness when those patterns are derived from insufficient or biased data, leading to the establishment of flawed constraint schematics. The system then interprets new, potentially liberating information through the filter of these pre-existing restrictive patterns. It's an internal denial of service attack, where the system is too busy processing self-imposed limitations to recognize novel solutions or pathways. The phantom leash functions much like a conditional override protocol in a complex industrial control system. The system can perform a certain action, e.g., increase pressure, adjust flow rate. But a pre-programmed condition, perhaps based on historical sensor data indicating a past failure or an erroneous safety parameter, prevents it from ever reaching that operational state. The hardware remains capable, but the software dictates impotence. The challenge is to identify and recode these conditional overrides to recalibrate the perceived operational envelope. Consider a scenario not of grand battles or cosmic endeavors, but of an intensely focused, high-stakes engineering project. A team of elite engineers is tasked with optimizing the thermal management system of a next-generation data center. The project's timeline is aggressive, the performance metrics unforgiving. Early simulations based on standard industry practices and existing material science constraints indicate a critical bottleneck. The heat dissipation requirements exceed the theoretical maximum capacity of current cooling technologies within the allocated physical footprint. For weeks, the team operates under this perceived constraint. Their discussions revolve around marginal gains, slight improvements in airflow, minor adjustments to fan speed algorithms, incremental shifts in coolant composition. The perceived limit, the physical boundary defined by the facility's existing architecture and the established performance curves of cooling units, acts as an invisible yet absolute ceiling. Alternative radical approaches are summarily dismissed as impractical, unfeasible, or outside the scope of current technology, not because of definitive empirical failure, but because they conflict with the established constraint schematics deeply embedded within their collective engineering consciousness. The lead engineer, a veteran known for his relentless questioning of assumptions, observes this stagnation. He notices a pattern. Every proposed solution, every thought experiment unconsciously terminates at this specific thermal boundary. It is a cognitive choke point. He does not explicitly label it a phantom leash, but he recognizes the symptoms of a self-imposed logical impasse. He initiates a mandatory first principles re-evaluation, not a brainstorming session which often remains tethered to existing paradigms, but a deconstruction of the problem to its most fundamental physical and chemical interactions. He challenges the implicit assumptions. Why must cooling be achieved through convection or phase change within these material constraints? Why is the definition of waste heat absolute? Through this rigorous, almost confrontational deconstruction, one junior engineer, freed from the traditional constraint schematics, posits a radical departure. Instead of focusing solely on dissipating heat, what if the excess thermal energy could be repurposed or transferred without traditional conversion? The idea, initially met with skepticism, involved exploring advanced thermoelectric materials and non-equilibrium thermodynamic cycles, concepts typically confined to theoretical physics journals, not data center design. The perceived constraint that the facility's heat dissipation limit was fixed was not a physical law, but an algorithmic parameter in the team's collective cognitive model. It was a phantom leash derived from historical performance data and conventional engineering wisdom. Once this parameter was critically interrogated and effectively recoded through a shift in perspective and the introduction of novel theoretical frameworks, the true operational ceiling elevated dramatically. The solution, while challenging to implement, was not physically impossible. It was merely computationally excluded by a pre-existing, unverified constraint schematic. The project shifted from incremental optimization within perceived limits to a groundbreaking re-engineering of the entire thermal energy management system. The impossible performance metrics were not only met but exceeded, demonstrating that the real bottleneck was not in the physical laws of thermodynamics, but in the self-imposed boundaries of engineering thought. The ability to identify and sever these invisible bonds is the hallmark of true command. It is the capacity to differentiate between an objective limitation, an immutable constant of the universe, and a programmed deferral of potential, a phantom leash woven from the threads of past experience and projected onto future possibility. The relentless pursuit of this distinction, the continuous calibration of internal constraint schematics against empirical reality, defines the operational aperture available to the high-performance individual. The unyielding vector is forged not by blindly challenging all limits, but by precisely identifying those that are truly illusory. Chapter 4. The Cognitive Aperture, Shaping the Observed. The field of existence is not a static canvas passively presented for your inspection. It is a dynamic, continuously rendered environment, its apparent attributes profoundly influenced, indeed often determined, by the specific configuration of your internal processing systems. This internal apparatus, the very mechanism through which reality is apprehended, functions as a cognitive aperture. It is the sophisticated, yet often unexamined lens through which all external phenomena are filtered, focused, and ultimately synthesized into your operative reality. Consider the human mind not as a mere receptor, but as an advanced sensor array, capable of selective tuning and adaptive processing. This aperture is not a fixed construct. It possesses variable focal lengths, adjustable gain settings, and an array of interpretive algorithms that determine the resolution and fidelity of the observed world. What you perceive as objective reality is, in essence, the output signal of this profoundly personalized processing unit. Your sensory inputs are merely raw data streams. The meaning, the implication, the very existence of an object or event within your experiential domain is sculpted by the pre-processing parameters embedded within this cognitive filter. The challenge, then, is to recognize that this aperture is often miscalibrated, its settings defaults inherited from ancestral programming, societal conditioning, or the inertial drift of unexamined experience. These default settings often result in a constricted field of view, an inherent bias in data interpretation, and a reduced capacity to discriminate signal from noise. Such a state translates directly into a perceived reality replete with artificial limitations and predetermined outcomes. You become a sophisticated observational platform operating on suboptimal parameters, inherently limited by its own internal configuration. The operational principle is straightforward. Your cognitive aperture selectively amplifies certain frequencies of information while attenuating others. It possesses an inherent bandwidth, prioritizing specific data points based on its current programming. If this programming is geared towards threat detection, the aperture will exhibit a hypervigilance for potential dangers, even in benign environments. If it is configured for scarcity, every opportunity will be viewed through a prism of insufficiency. This is not merely a psychological quirk, it is a fundamental engineering parameter of your subjective experience. Every belief held, every assumption accepted, every value internalized, functions as a programmatic instruction set for this aperture. These instructions dictate its focus, its interpretive frameworks, and its threshold for what constitutes relevant data. A deeply ingrained belief in one's own limitations, for instance, acts as a hard-coded filter. It effectively blinds the observer to opportunities that contradict this internal dictum, or it distorts them into unworkable propositions. The data is present in the external field, but the aperture is simply not configured to register it as viable input. It's a bandwidth constraint imposed not by the universe, but by your own internal architecture. This mechanism is why two individuals can occupy the identical spatio-temporal coordinate, observe the same external event, and yet generate two entirely divergent experiential realities. One perceives an insurmountable obstacle, the other, a strategic challenge requiring novel solutions. The external variables remain constant. The differential lies in the calibration of their respective cognitive apertures. One operates with a narrow, fixed focus, locked onto potential failure vectors. The other employs a broader, adaptive lens, actively seeking emergent pathways. The imperative, therefore, is to assert command over the calibration of this aperture. This is not a passive philosophical exercise, but an active, deliberate engineering task. It demands conscious interrogation of the installed belief systems and the default interpretive algorithms. You must systematically identify which parameters are limiting your field of observation and which are serving as accurate, high-fidelity transducers of potential. This process involves a rigorous re-evaluation of the data filters you unconsciously employ. To recalibrate, one must first identify the current settings. This requires a detached observation of your own reactions, your default interpretations, and the patterns of your emotional resonance. When confronted with a novel situation, what is your immediate, unfiltered cognitive response? Is it expansion or contraction? Is it analysis or resignation? These immediate outputs are diagnostics of your aperture's current state. They reveal the inherent biases, the established gain settings, and the default focal points. The conscious adjustment begins with the discipline of assent. Every external impression, every perceived datum, presents itself for your internal processing. The power resides in the decision to either accept its raw, unprocessed form or to subject it to a deliberate, rational analysis before it passes through the interpretive filters of your pre-programmed aperture. This is the crucial moment of interdiction, the point at which you can prevent the automatic deployment of limiting parameters. Instead of allowing the aperture to snap to its default setting of fear or doubt, you consciously direct it to a setting of detached inquiry, of potential analysis. This re-engineering of the cognitive aperture demands persistent application. It is akin to refining a precision instrument, making micro-adjustments to optimize its performance. You are training yourself to achieve a state of cognitive fluency, where the act of deliberate calibration becomes a reflexive capability rather than an arduous struggle. The goal is to develop an aperture that is highly adaptive, capable of dynamically adjusting its parameters to suit the specific demands of any given environment, rather than imposing a single rigid interpretive framework onto all inputs. Consider the concept of signal-to-noise ratio. A miscalibrated aperture is often characterized by a high noise floor, where irrelevant or distracting information overwhelms the crucial data. Conscious calibration involves raising the signal strength of relevant information and actively suppressing the noise. This is achieved by directing your internal processing power, your attention, with surgical precision. What you choose to focus on, what data you permit to occupy the foreground of your consciousness, directly influences the output of your cognitive aperture. It is an act of deliberate frequency tuning. The ultimate aim is not to perceive a reality devoid of challenge or difficulty. That would be an act of delusion, a catastrophic malfunction of the aperture. Rather, the objective is to perceive challenges with absolute clarity, stripped of the distorting overlays of fear, past conditioning, or limiting beliefs. It is to observe the operational landscape with the highest possible resolution, identifying true constraints from perceived ones, distinguishing authentic opportunities from mirages. An optimally calibrated aperture reveals the true topology of the field, unmarred by internal projections. This mastery over the cognitive aperture is foundational. It precedes all other forms of external command and internal architecture. For if your primary interface with reality is flawed, all subsequent actions, no matter how well-intentioned or rigorously executed, will be operating on corrupted data. The command you seek to exert over your external environment and the territory you endeavor to architect within begins with the precise, deliberate engineering of the lens through which you observe it all. The world, in its essence, is not given. It is perpetually constructed through the aperture of your own consciousness. Your responsibility, then, is to ensure that this instrument is tuned for optimal truth and uncompromised potential. This systematic calibration, this deliberate tuning of the internal lens, extends beyond mere practical advantage. It is a metaphysical undertaking. If reality is, in part, a construct of the observing consciousness, then the quality of that consciousness dictates the very fabric of the experienced cosmos. The ancient philosophies understood this implicitly, recognizing that the external world mirrors the internal state. Your cognitive aperture is not just a passive receiver, it is an active projector, contributing to the emergent properties of the field it observes. This phenomenon, often observed at the quantum level, where the act of observation fundamentally alters the observed, scales upwards to the macrocosm of your daily existence. The universe, in its responsive capacity, presents itself in congruence with the parameters you establish internally. A fixed aperture, locked in patterns of scarcity and limitation, will persistently encounter confirmation of those very restrictions, not because the universe is inherently scarce, but because its observational parameters are fixed to that particular frequency. This profound interdependency places an immense burden of responsibility upon the individual. The Stoic discipline, particularly the rigorous application of the discipline of assent, provides the operational framework for this responsibility. It mandates that no impression, no data packet from the external world be granted uncritical entry into the interpretive architecture of your mind. Each perceived event, each sudden stimulus must be held at a critical distance, interrogated with the unyielding logic of reason. Is this impression accurate? Is it within my control? What is its true nature, stripped of the emotional overlays my default aperture might impose? This pause, this instant of interdiction, is where true agency resides. It is the moment you prevent your pre-programmed filters from autonomously rendering a distorted reality. By systematically exercising this discipline, you are not merely adjusting a lens, you are actively re-architecting the substrate of your perception. You are moving beyond a reactive state, where external inputs dictate internal resonance, towards a proactive posture, where your internal coherence dictates the interpretation of all external stimuli. This reorientation establishes an internal command center, immune to the chaotic flux of the external environment. The sage, in the Stoic tradition, is not unfeeling, but possesses an aperture so exquisitely calibrated that external events, whether fortune or adversity, are processed through a lens of rational equanimity. They are stripped of their power to provoke emotional disturbance because the interpretive parameters have been preset to evaluate them strictly against the criteria of what is within one's control and what is not. The ultimate aspiration of this calibration is not mere personal tranquility, but an alignment with what the Stoics termed the logos, the universal reason, the rational order permeating the cosmos. A perfectly tuned aperture, free from the distortions of egoic biases and conditioned responses, becomes a conduit for this universal intelligence. It perceives the inherent rationality in the unfolding of events, even those seemingly chaotic or tragic. It sees the underlying design, the causal matrix that underpins existence, not as a mystical revelation, but as a logical extension of its own refined observational capacity. This is the metaphysical culmination, the individual consciousness, through precise internal engineering, achieving resonance with the fundamental operating principles of the universe itself. When the aperture is miscalibrated, when it operates on defaults of fear, greed, or unexamined impulse, the resultant perceived reality is one of perpetual suffering and friction. This suffering is not a punitive external force, but the direct output of a system operating out of sync with its own potential and with the underlying order of the universe. It is the screeching feedback loop of a misaligned frequency, a direct consequence of refusing to engage in the rigorous work of self-calibration. The individual then experiences discord, a constant battle against an external world that seems inherently hostile, when in reality the hostility is a projection, a shadow cast by the internal state of the observer. The unexamined life in this context is not just unfulfilling, it is an existence of avoidable friction and self-imposed limitation. Your will, your prohairesis, is the executive function responsible for this ongoing calibration. It is the singular command center that possesses the authority to override default settings, to initiate new programming, and to continuously refine the sensor array. This is the only domain over which you possess absolute, undisputed sovereignty. External events are merely data streams. The meaning assigned, the impact felt, the action taken, these are the outputs of your internal processing directly subject to your will. To neglect this responsibility is to surrender control of your primary interface with reality, allowing archaic programs and external influences to dictate your experience. It is to cede the controls of a sophisticated observational craft to automated, often detrimental subroutines. The architectonic purpose of this endeavor is to move beyond merely reacting to the world to actively participating in its coherent unfolding. A precisely calibrated aperture allows you to perceive genuine opportunities, true constraints, and authentic leverage points within any given system. It differentiates between what is immutable fact and what is malleable perception. This discerning capacity is the hallmark of true power, enabling surgical precision in action and an unshakable clarity in judgment. You are no longer navigating by guesswork or inherited dogma, but by direct, unvarnished insight into the operational dynamics of your environment. This is the state where perception itself becomes a strategic asset, a high-resolution map of the territory that others perceive only as an undifferentiated blur. This persistent engineering of the cognitive aperture creates a state of internal invulnerability. Not an invulnerability to external events, for the universe remains indifferent to individual preferences, but an invulnerability to misinterpretation of those events. You are fortified against the destructive power of emotional overreaction, against the paralysis of fear, and against the seductive lure of delusion. Your internal compass, consistently aligned with rational principles and universal order, provides an unshakable point of reference, irrespective of external turbulence. This is the deepest form of self-mastery, the absolute command over the genesis and interpretation of your own lived reality. It is the ultimate expression of human agency, transforming raw existence into a field of coherent action and profound understanding. Chapter 5. The Immutable Core, Architecting Inner Territory. We have observed the mechanisms through which external stimuli warp the lens of perception, charting the apertures that frame our observable reality. The profound implications of a mind perpetually calibrated by external command have been laid bare. Now we shift focus from the dynamic interface of observation to the static bedrock beneath the flux, the immutable core. This is not a retreat from the world, but a strategic re-anchoring within the only domain truly available for absolute jurisdiction, the inner territory. Consider the human psyche not as a malleable aggregate of experiences, but as a complex adaptive system possessing a fundamental operating layer. This layer, the immutable core, functions as the system's kernel. It is the unmodifiable, foundational code that dictates primary directives, executes core processes, and maintains system integrity, irrespective of the application-level noise or external data streams. It predates the external narratives that attempt to define us, lying beneath the transient identities projected onto the socio-economic field. This core is the unyielding constant, the gravitational singularity around which all phenomenal experience orbits, yet cannot penetrate. Architecting this inner territory demands a precision commensurate with high-stakes engineering. It is the construction of a psychological infrastructure designed for maximum resilience and operational autonomy. We are not merely adjusting parameters, we are designing the very architecture of internal sovereignty, establishing robust protocols against cognitive intrusion and environmental entropy. The objective is to delineate a psychic perimeter, fortify the internal processing unit, and instantiate a self-referential framework impervious to the entropic forces of external validation or disparagement. The first principle of this architecture is the rigorous identification of actual internal jurisdiction. Many perceive an expansive internal realm, yet operate within a fragmented landscape riddled with external access points. True inner territory is finite, its boundaries defined by the intersection of volitional capacity and cognitive processing. Everything outside this boundary, including external events, other individuals' opinions, and the unpredictable variables of the cosmic field, belongs to the realm of non-control. This distinction is not a philosophical nicety. It is the fundamental system partitioning required for secure operation. To architect this domain, one must first define its root directory. This root is not an emotion or a fleeting desire, but a set of self-generated foundational axioms. These axioms are the non-negotiable truths about one's purpose, one's non-negotiable values, and one's ultimate operational parameters. They are hard-coded into the system, functioning as immutable constants. Unlike beliefs derived from external consensus, these axioms are self-validating. They form the internal consensus, the foundational protocol stack upon which all subsequent decision-making processes are built. To illustrate, if one's root axiom is the pursuit of mastery, then every internal resource, attention, time, cognitive bandwidth, is automatically routed and prioritized to align with this primary directive. Any external signal attempting to reroute these resources is flagged as an anomaly, an intrusion attempt against the core system. The architecture then proceeds to establish its internal network topology. This involves configuring the pathways of thought, emotion, and action to flow consistently from the immutable core. Imagine a data network where every packet of information, every decision, every emotional response must pass through a strict routing protocol, validated against the root axioms. Discrepancies are not ignored. They are processed as errors requiring immediate debugging or rerouting. This is the antithesis of a passively reactive system. It is a continuously monitored, actively managed internal infrastructure. Central to this architecture is the concept of psychological access control lists, ACLs. Just as a secure network restricts access to critical resources, your inner territory must define explicit permissions for incoming data. External narratives, criticisms, praise, or even seemingly benign information fragments must pass through a filtering mechanism. Is this input aligned with my root axioms? Does it threaten the integrity of my internal state? Does it provide actionable intelligence for my operational parameters? If the answer is no, access is denied. This is not about building an emotional vacuum. It is about preventing unauthorized writes to the core system, protecting against data corruption and system crashes induced by irrelevant or malicious external signals. Consider the energy consumption of your internal processing unit. Every thought, every emotional reaction demands a share of this finite resource. An unarchitected inner territory is a system running multiple background processes, many of them extraneous or self-defeating, draining processing power. Architecting the immutable core involves optimizing resource allocation. This means consciously terminating non-essential processes, the ceaseless rumination on past failures, the anticipation of future catastrophes, the engagement with irrelevant social dynamics. By eliminating these parasitic processes, you free up critical cognitive bandwidth and energy, directing it towards the execution of your primary directives, fortifying the core and expanding the functional capacity of your inner domain. This is not merely discipline. It is advanced system optimization. The hardening of this inner territory against external shock requires the implementation of fault-tolerant design principles. Life will inevitably present black swan events, critical system failures, and unexpected disruptions. A robust internal architecture does not merely cope. It is designed to maintain operational integrity under extreme duress. This involves building redundancy into one's foundational axioms. If one pathway to achieving a core purpose is blocked, the system automatically reroutes through an alternative pre-designed channel. This resilience is not born of stubbornness, but of foresight, the meticulous mapping of potential failure modes and the proactive development of contingency protocols. It's an internal RAID array, ensuring data persistence even when components fail. The immutable core is not a static concept to be grasped intellectually and then set aside. It is a living, evolving system that requires continuous maintenance, rigorous stress testing, and periodic firmware updates. As an architect of your inner territory, you are perpetually engaged in this process. You are the systems administrator, the network engineer, and the security specialist, all operating within the confines of your own consciousness. The precision of your self-observation, the rigor of your internal logging, and the uncompromising adherence to your self-defined operational parameters determine the stability and performance of this critical system. This construction yields profound dividends. When your inner territory is meticulously architected, when its core is truly immutable, the fluctuations of the external world lose their capacity to destabilize. The emotional volatility of others becomes background noise. The gravitational pull of external command dissipates. You operate from a stable, self-generated reference frame, a zero-point energy field that provides unwavering consistency. This state is not one of emotional indifference, but of strategic impermeability. Your capacity for objective analysis, decisive action, and sustained progress becomes uncompromised, unperturbed by the transient chaos that governs the unarchitected mind. The ultimate aim of architecting the immutable core is to establish an internal operating environment so robust, so self-sufficient, that it functions as a perfect computational engine. Its outputs, your decisions, your actions, your very presence, are consistently aligned with your highest principles, irrespective of external pressure. This is the genesis of an unyielding vector, a trajectory of purpose propelled from within, impervious to the external cross-currents. You cease to be a vessel steered by prevailing winds and become instead a self-propelling craft, charting a course dictated by an internal navigation system calibrated for absolute precision. This internal dominion is not granted. It is architected, rigorously maintained, and defended with unyielding vigilance. Chapter 6. The Unbinding Equation. Disengaging from external anchors. The human operating system by default seeks stabilization. It calibrates against perceived environmental constants. Yet, much of what is deemed constant, much of what anchors consciousness, is merely a transient data stream. The critical juncture, the inflection point in the cultivation of an unassailable inner domain, lies in the systematic disengagement from these external anchors. This is not a philosophy of isolation, but an engineering directive to sever dependency vectors that introduce systemic vulnerability. Consider the energetic cost. Every external anchor, every expectation from others, every fleeting validation sought, every outcome tethered to an emotional imperative, constitutes a parasitic load on your internal processing capacity. Each point of attachment acts as a signal conduit, injecting noise, inducing latency, and demanding computational cycles that could otherwise be allocated to higher-order functions. The unbinding equation, therefore, is a protocol for energetic reclamation. It is the architectural revision that reroutes power from external dependencies to the immutable core. We must first identify these anchors with surgical precision. They are not always overt. Often they masquerade as natural extensions of ambition, as prerequisites for progress, or as the implicit terms of social engagement. An anchor might be the approval of a peer group, the financial valuation of an endeavor, the public reception of an idea, or even the trajectory of a competitor. Each represents a potential point of failure, an external switch that can interrupt your primary directive. The objective is not to ignore these variables, but to decouple your internal state and strategic calculus from their deterministic influence. The process commences with an impedance match, the alignment of your internal metric system with your intrinsic value. When the external world dictates your success parameters, you are operating in a mismatched circuit. Every external surge, every dip, registers as a direct alteration of your internal power supply. To disengage, you must recalibrate your internal oscilloscopes. Your signal-to-noise ratio improves not by silencing the world, but by filtering its extraneous frequencies at the source, within your own processing unit. This demands a ruthless audit of the metrics you unconsciously accept as definitive. If your worth is benchmarked against market cap fluctuations, or your tranquility against public opinion, you have effectively outsourced your internal regulator. This is the principle of volitional decoupling. It's a deliberate act of disconnecting external feedback loops from your internal core systems. Imagine a deep space probe. Its mission parameters are pre-programmed, its internal clock calibrated against a universal constant, not the fleeting light of a passing star. Its navigation systems are designed to operate autonomously, even when external telemetry is lost or corrupted. The probe does not seek validation from Earth's cheers. It executes its mission based on its internal programming and the immutable laws of physics. Your personal operating system requires a similar architecture. The anchors themselves are often rooted in a fundamental misattribution of control. We assign power to external entities, events, individuals, institutions, that upon rigorous analysis possess no inherent authority over our internal landscape. This misattribution creates a gravitational well. The more energy we invest in an external outcome, the deeper this well becomes, exerting a stronger pull, distorting our perception, and bending our actions towards its gravitational center. The unbinding equation mandates reaching escape velocity from this well. This requires a sustained, deliberate application of internal force to break free from orbit. It means recognizing that the external force field, while real in its effect on the physical world, holds no jurisdiction over your self-governance. Consider the practical application of this. In complex system engineering, redundancy is built into critical components to prevent single points of failure. In the human domain, this translates to diversifying your sources of fulfillment, validation, and purpose, such that no single external anchor can cripple your operational integrity. If your entire self-definition is tethered to a specific professional title, the loss of that title becomes catastrophic. If your inner calm depends solely on the behavior of a single individual, you become a puppet to their whims. The unbinding equation teaches us to shed these singular dependencies, to distribute our existential load, and to fortify our core against localized external shocks. This is not a retreat into apathy. It is an act of strategic self-preservation, ensuring that your optimal performance curve remains independent of external perturbations. It allows for engagement without entanglement, participation without subjugation. You can observe the external field, process its data, and even influence it without allowing its transient state to dictate your internal frequency. It is the difference between being a leaf caught in a storm and being the storm's core, unmoved, generating its own immense pressure field. The calibration of this detachment demands persistent vigilance. The human mind has a tendency to re-establish connections, to seek out new anchors even after old ones are severed. This is a subtle yet relentless gravitational pull, a background radiation of social expectation and egoic craving. The unbinding equation is not a one-time calculation. It is a continuous re-evaluation, a dynamic adjustment of your internal gyroscopes to maintain a zero-drift state regardless of external turbulence. Every day presents new opportunities for external forces to insinuate themselves into your internal framework. Each must be identified, analyzed for its potential parasitic load, and deliberately nullified or isolated. Imagine a critical infrastructure project, the construction of a deep-water oil platform in an unforgiving marine environment. The project lead, a seasoned engineer, faces a confluence of immense pressures. The initial financial projections have been aggressively optimistic, creating a palpable tension with investors who demand an accelerated timeline. Public opinion, fueled by environmental concerns, watches every move, ready to amplify any misstep into a scandal. Competitors are rapidly deploying rival technologies, placing additional strain on the project's perceived originality and market advantage. Internally, team morale is fragile, oscillating between periods of intense productivity and moments of paralyzing doubt. Each of these represents an external anchor, threatening to compromise the integrity of the project's execution. The project lead is aware of the constant barrage of external data, the daily stock fluctuations affecting the parent company, the scathing headlines, the hushed conversations among board members regarding budget overruns. He acknowledges the existence of these variables, but refuses to permit them to dictate his operational cadence. He does not seek validation from the quarterly earnings report. He does not adjust his engineering protocols based on the transient anxieties of the public. He actively disengages from the emotional implications of competitor advancements, viewing them as data points for strategic analysis, not as existential threats to his team's intrinsic value. Instead, he calibrates his internal compass solely against the project's foundational objectives: structural integrity, operational safety, and long-term efficiency. His decision-making process is a closed-loop system, primarily fed by real-time engineering data, risk assessment matrices, and the established protocols for deep-water construction. When a critical component shows a fractional deviation from stress tolerance during simulation, he does not panic about the headline it might generate. He initiates a methodical re-evaluation of material specifications, allocates additional time for retesting, and communicates only the necessary data-driven implications to his core team. He understands that allowing the project's trajectory to be dictated by the volatile currents of public perception or investor impatience would be to introduce systemic instability. The outcome would be a platform built not on robust engineering, but on appeasement and reactive adjustments, inherently flawed and susceptible to catastrophic failure. His disengagement from these external anchors permits him to maintain a steady operational pulse, to make hard, data-driven decisions that prioritize the long-term viability of the structure over the short-term appeasement of external stakeholders. The financial pressure, the public scrutiny, the competitive landscape, these are acknowledged as external conditions, but they are not permitted to modulate the internal frequency of his leadership. He remains the center of gravity for the project, allowing its success to be defined by internal excellence, not external validation. This calibrated detachment, this unbinding from the gravitational pull of exogenous factors, is the prerequisite for command. It ensures that your operational domain remains sovereign, uncompromised by the chaotic entropy of the external world. To surrender this internal authority is to relinquish your most potent instrument of agency. The unbinding equation is not merely a philosophical construct. It is a critical operational protocol for any entity seeking to navigate a complex, volatile reality with maximum integrity and impact. Chapter 7. The Volitional Algorithm: Programming Response to Chaos. The external plane is an unceasing cascade of variable inputs, a stochastic field. It offers no inherent stability, no guaranteed equilibrium. Chapter 6 elucidated the necessary disengagement, the severing of the external anchor lines. That unbinding, however, is not a final state. It is merely the precondition for genuine autonomy. Disconnection permits a deeper integration, a calculated repatterning of the self. The absence of external command creates a void. This void must be deliberately filled, not by default, but by design. Enter the volitional algorithm. This is not a passive philosophical stance, nor a reactive emotional buffer. It is a consciously engineered protocol, a robust, internal computational architecture designed to process, interpret, and respond to the ceaseless flux of external data. It represents the transition from merely withstanding chaos to operating within its parameters with pre-calibrated intent. Its purpose is to deterministically chart an internal course, irrespective of the probabilistic turbulence beyond your skin. Consider its core function, the transformation of raw, unmediated external stimuli into actionable, congruent internal directives. This process begins with sophisticated input filtration. The external world bombards the sensorium with petabytes of information. Most of it is noise. Without a filtering mechanism, this data flood induces cognitive overload, scattering attention, diluting focus. The volitional algorithm initiates an immediate, pre-programmed scan. It distinguishes relevant signals from irrelevant static. It operates like an advanced firewall, allowing only data packets congruent with your core mission parameters to penetrate deeper into your internal processing core. Irrelevant data is discarded at the periphery, never permitted to trigger an emotional resonance or cognitive derailment. This is not denial, it is ruthless signal processing, prioritizing bandwidth for what genuinely merits attention. It is the practical application of Stoic assent, the active selection of what mental impressions are permitted to take root and which are summarily dismissed as inconsequential to the fundamental architecture of your inner citadel. This intellectual triage is a primary defense, establishing a robust signal-to-noise ratio within your internal environment. It acknowledges the inescapable reality of the external world as a source of information, yet asserts an unyielding command over which segments of that information are granted cognitive processing time. This initial filtering is paramount, for an unfiltered mind is a conduit for external entropy, a passive receiver overwhelmed by extraneous data. Your conscious will, embedded within this algorithm, acts as the sovereign gatekeeper. Once filtered, the relevant data is subjected to the decision matrix calibration. This is where your immutable core, your architected inner territory, becomes the governing logic. The volitional algorithm contains a hard-coded set of ethical constants, operational principles, and existential priorities. These are not fluid concepts. They are fixed points, established through rigorous internal examination and commitment. When external data reaches this matrix, it is not met with improvisation. It is tested against these predefined parameters. Each decision becomes the output of a logical gate, evaluating congruence. Does this align with my established purpose? Does this violate my core principles? Is this within my sphere of control or influence? The response is not an emotional surge. It is the logical output of a pre-computed truth table. This eliminates hesitation, reduces analytical paralysis, and removes the volatile variable of sentiment from high-stakes calculus. This matrix is the codified expression of proheresis, your ruling faculty, distilled into a set of inviolable operational directives. It represents the unwavering commitment to your foundational values, converting abstract ethical positions into executable code. Metaphysically, this act of codification asserts your specific individuated logos against the formless chaos. It is the creation of internal order, a microcosm of absolute principle, reflecting a deliberate participation in the universe's deeper, rational structures. This internal logic is your anchor, immutable and unassailable, providing a deterministic framework for judgment in a world of probabilistic outcomes. The very act of designing this matrix is an exercise in profound self-knowledge, a descent into the bedrock of your being to extract the non-negotiable truths that will govern all subsequent action and inaction. It demands an unflinching gaze into the nature of virtue and purpose, establishing a set of axioms from which all future decisions will be logically derived. The final stage is output generation. This is the translation of calibrated internal directives into external action, or, crucially, into deliberate inaction. The volitional algorithm doesn't merely decide, it commits to a response, then executes. This execution is stripped of the friction inherent in doubt or fear. It is a compiled program, loaded and run. If the matrix dictates no action is required, the algorithm registers a null response, conserving energy. If it dictates a specific countermeasure or initiative, the necessary command sequences are issued without delay. This ensures that your actions, or your deliberate abstention, are always products of internal design, not external compulsion or reactive reflex. This phase is characterized by an absolute absence of internal resistance, a frictionless conversion of internal decree into external manifestation. It embodies the Stoic ideal of performing one's duty without internal turmoil, acting with a unified will. The output, whether a forceful engagement or a serene withdrawal, is the precise, calculated result of your internal architecture, uncorrupted by vacillation or external pressure. This level of execution transforms intention into an immediate, impactful reality, bypassing the psychological latency typical of the unprogrammed mind. It is the manifestation of apatheia not as indifference, but as clarity of purpose, enabling action free from irrational passion. The profound advantage of this pre-engineered response system lies in algorithmic pre-computation. The external world, while chaotic, often presents recurring patterns of disruption. By establishing the volitional algorithm, you effectively pre-solve a vast spectrum of potential problems. You anticipate common vectors of entropy and hard-code your preferred response. When a familiar chaotic event arises, your system already possesses the optimized operational sequence. This reduces the real-time cognitive load to near zero, freeing mental resources for novel challenges. It's akin to an autonomous navigation system, plotting optimal routes and alternative pathways long before encountering a blockade. The energy typically expended in real-time deliberation and emotional management during crisis is conserved, redirected towards higher-order strategic initiatives. This pre-computation is a direct application of premeditatio malorum, the Stoic practice of foreseeing and preparing for potential adversities. It extends beyond mere psychological readiness. It is the integration of foresight into the very operational architecture of yourself. By mapping anticipated challenges against your decision matrix, you front-load the cognitive burden, resolving potential conflicts before they arise in the immediacy of external impact. This is a strategic advantage, transforming surprise into expected variation and reducing reaction time to an infinitesimal fraction. It allows for the conservation of vital mental and emotional reserves, ensuring that the full force of your intellect and will is available for truly unprecedented circumstances rather than being squandered on predictable patterns of turbulence. This algorithm is not static. It incorporates adaptive iteration. Every output, every action generates feedback. The volitional algorithm possesses an internal diagnostic array. It assesses the congruence between intended outcome and actual result. Discrepancies are logged as deviations. This data is then used to refine the algorithm's parameters, to recalibrate its decision matrix, to optimize its input filtration. It learns. It evolves, not through passive exposure, but through active, deliberate error correction and performance enhancement. This continuous feedback loop ensures that your internal system becomes progressively more robust, more efficient, more perfectly aligned with your evolving understanding of optimal function. It is a self-optimizing system operating in a dynamic environment. This iterative process embodies the relentless pursuit of arete, or excellence, central to Stoic philosophy. It transforms every experience, every interaction with the external field into a data point for refinement. This is not merely learning from mistakes, it is a systematic engineering approach to self-perfection, a constant calibration of your internal mechanisms against the objective feedback of reality. The metaphysical implication is profound. You are not merely a static entity, but a dynamic, self-revising system, actively participating in your own evolution towards a more perfect expression of your inherent nature. Each cycle of input, processing, output, and feedback brings your internal state into closer alignment with the universal ordering principle, reflecting a profound synergy between individual will and cosmic rationality. This programmed response mechanism functions as a potent form of entropy resistance. The second law of thermodynamics dictates a universe trending towards disorder. External events are constantly eroding structure, generating noise, and attempting to destabilize your internal order. The volitional algorithm acts as a robust, self-regulating system that actively resists this entropic pull. By maintaining a deterministic interiority, a predictable, logical framework for processing and responding, you impose order upon your personal operational field, regardless of the probabilistic exteriority. Your internal state becomes a bastion of calculated order, a crystalline structure impervious to the corrosive forces of external randomness. It is the conscious imposition of will against the tide of indiscriminate flux. This resistance is not a struggle against the universe, but an assertion of internal autonomy within it. Metaphysically, your volitional algorithm becomes a localized vortex of anti-entropy, a self-sustaining system that generates order in its immediate operational sphere. It acknowledges the larger universal flow towards disorder, yet establishes a deliberate countercurrent within your consciousness. This is an act of profound metaphysical engineering, constructing a personal reality based on principles of order, reason and congruence, irrespective of the surrounding chaos. It ensures that your internal architecture remains coherent, resilient, and continuously optimized, a bastion of rational function amidst the relentless dissolution. The distinction is critical. This is not an attempt to control the chaos itself. That endeavor is futile, a misdirection of scarce resources. The universe remains indifferent to your preferences. Instead, the volitional algorithm grants you absolute sovereignty over your interaction with chaos. It shifts the locus of control entirely inward. You relinquish the illusion of external manipulation and embrace the immutable power of internal programming. Your life trajectory ceases to be a product of circumstance and becomes instead the direct output of your meticulously engineered internal processing system. This profound shift is the essence of true freedom. Not freedom from external constraint, but freedom within the only domain genuinely subject to your absolute command. This is not merely a philosophical concept, but a hard-coded reality within yourself. This programming extends beyond immediate crisis response. It shapes the proactive architecture of your daily existence. Every decision, from the micro-calibration of personal habits to the macro-strategy of professional endeavors, is rooted through this algorithm. It ensures consistency. It ensures congruence. It ensures that every action taken, every word spoken, every commitment honored is a direct, unfiltered expression of your deepest, most considered principles, rather than a fleeting impulse or a reaction to external pressure. It is the continuous execution of a master program written by you for you. This comprehensive integration ensures a seamless coherence across all aspects of your life. It eliminates the fragmentation often caused by disparate intentions and external influences, forging a unified, purposeful existence. Your internal system becomes a deterministic state machine, where inputs consistently yield outputs that are perfectly aligned with your established core. This relentless consistency builds an internal resilience that renders external fluctuations largely irrelevant to your core trajectory. The chaotic external environment therefore ceases to be a source of destabilization and transforms into a data stream for system refinement. Each challenge, each unforeseen event, becomes an opportunity to test the algorithm's robustness, to identify areas for optimization, to validate its core assumptions. You do not fear these inputs. You welcome them as calibration points. The inherent unpredictability of existence becomes the proving ground for your internal architecture. This reframing of external challenge is a radical paradigm shift. It converts potential threats into invaluable diagnostic data, accelerating the optimization of your internal system. This is active engagement, not passive endurance. Each shock, each unexpected deviation strengthens the system, making it more resilient, more precise, more aligned with its core purpose. The universe, in its indifferent flux, inadvertently provides the crucible for your ultimate self-mastery. To program this algorithm requires unwavering self-assessment and a ruthless commitment to clarity. You must define your non-negotiables. You must codify your ethical boundaries. You must articulate your core purpose with unflinching precision. These are the constants, the hard-coded instructions that will govern your every processed response. Any ambiguity in these foundational parameters will introduce logical errors into the system, leading to inconsistent outputs. The more precise your self-definition, the more robust and reliable your volitional algorithm will be. This meticulous self-definition is the foundational engineering task, demanding a profound clarity of intent and an unwavering gaze into your own essence. It is the arduous work of distinguishing essential truth from transient preference, of solidifying principles into unyielding parameters. This act of self-coding is not merely psychological, it is an assertion of your metaphysical identity, defining the very nature of your internal universe. Embrace the engineering mindset. View your consciousness not as a malleable, reactive entity, but as a sophisticated processing unit requiring deliberate architecture and meticulous programming. Your freedom is not found in the absence of constraint, but in the self-imposed constraint of a perfectly ordered internal system. This is the ultimate act of will, to define your operational parameters and execute them with the cold, unyielding precision of an algorithm. To become the architect of your own unshakable internal order, commanding your response to the boundless, unceasing chaos. Chapter 8. The Interdiction Protocol, Fortifying the Inner Citadel. The volitional algorithm, once programmed, is a potent instrument. It equips the mind with a calculated response capacity, translating raw external stimuli into an optimized internal output. Yet, mere response, however precise, is insufficient for absolute command. The inner territory, once architected and calibrated, requires an active defense matrix. It demands an interdiction protocol. This protocol is not a retreat from the field of chaos. It is a strategic engagement, a preemptive defense against the insidious ingress of external noise, unverified data, and corrosive influence. It shifts the paradigm from merely responding to incoming vectors to actively controlling which vectors are permitted entry into the operational core of the self. Consider it the firewall for the soul, the electromagnetic shielding for the conscious processor, ensuring signal integrity in an environment saturated with interference. The inner citadel is not a passive structure. It is a dynamic system, constantly interacting with its environment. Without an interdiction protocol, even the most robust internal architecture remains vulnerable to silent erosion. Unfiltered information, unexamined narratives, and external emotional contagion can compromise internal stability, subtly recalibrating the very algorithms we meticulously designed. The objective, therefore, is to establish an impenetrable perimeter, a cognitive exclusion zone, where only data validated against our core principles is granted passage. Defining the perimeter begins with an audit of threat vectors. These are not always overt assaults. Often they are ambient, insidious, masquerading as benign input. Unsolicited opinions, societal default settings, the relentless current of media narratives, the emotional states of those around us, these constitute a continuous broadcast. Without an active filter, they permeate the cognitive boundary, creating resonance points that can trigger internal cascade failures. These ingress points exploit our inherent neural architectures, often bypassing conscious scrutiny. The mind, in its default state, is a receptive antenna. The interdiction protocol transforms this antenna into a discriminator, a guardian at the gate. It requires an advanced application of the cognitive aperture, moving beyond mere observation to a forensic analysis of incoming data streams. We are not just shaping the observed, we are discerning its intent, its inherent integrity, and its potential to destabilize our operational parameters. Consider Phase 1 of the Interdiction protocol, preemptive scan and identification. This is where the mind acts as a high-resolution sensor array, constantly monitoring the environment for anomalies. Every piece of information, every opinion, every emotional overture from an external source is subjected to an initial sweep. This scan operates on a fundamental premise. All external input is presumed hostile or irrelevant until proven otherwise. This is not paranoia, it is strategic vigilance. This phase involves an immediate subconscious query. What is the source signature? What is its intended effect? Does it align with my immutable core, or does it attempt to project an external command structure? This pre-filtering mechanism prevents the bulk of external noise from even reaching the higher cognitive functions. It is the equivalent of a network router discarding malformed packets at the ingress port, preventing them from consuming internal processing cycles. This conserves vital mental energy, redirecting it from reactive filtering to proactive strategic thought. Following identification, Phase 2 of the protocol initiates data validation and signature matching. Any input that passes the initial scan is then rigorously cross-referenced against the established tenets of our immutable core and the calibrated functions of our volitional algorithm. This is the truth table of the inner operating system. Does this external datum enhance or diminish my purpose? Does it align with my principles of action and being, or does it introduce logical inconsistencies? This validation is not an emotional process, it is a cold, objective assessment. If an external narrative attempts to dictate an emotional response not congruent with our programmed volition, it is flagged. If an unsolicited opinion proposes a course of action contrary to our strategic objectives, it is rejected. This is where the unshakable self, defined in Chapter 5, becomes the ultimate arbiter. It's a real-time data integrity check, ensuring that only information that upholds and reinforces our internal coherence is permitted to integrate. Any data that would compromise internal consistency is isolated. Phase 3 is containment and discard. This is the active deployment of the unbinding equation, not as a singular act of detachment, but as an institutionalized mechanism. Input that fails validation, that is deemed hostile, irrelevant, or integrity compromising, is not engaged with. It is contained at the perimeter and discarded. It is prevented from triggering internal resonance cascades, those insidious chains of detrimental thought or emotional reactivity that can unravel internal composure. This containment creates an internal quarantine zone. Unverified or hostile information is held in an isolated buffer, preventing its code from executing within the core system. It is observed, categorized, understood for its external nature, but denied any internal processing power. This is not about denial, it is about controlled interaction. We acknowledge the existence of the external noise, but refuse its access to our internal operational integrity. The external may rage, but within the citadel, the chosen frequencies remain undisturbed. The strategic deployment of this protocol fortifies the citadel's walls, creating layers of defense that ensure unassailable autonomy. The first layer is psychological shielding. This is the active cultivation of an indifference to the inconsequential, a mental immunity to external psychological interference. Just as electromagnetic shielding protects sensitive electronics from ambient noise, we construct a cognitive field that deflects the incessant bombardment of opinions, judgments, and fleeting trends. This is not apathy, it is the strategic redirection of focus. Our mental bandwidth is too precious to be consumed by what does not serve our core purpose. The second layer is volitional integrity fields. These are the reinforced boundaries around our chosen responses and intentions. The volitional algorithm, once programmed, must be protected from external attempts at reprogramming. Every decision, every action is an affirmation of this field. When an external demand contradicts our internal mandate, the integrity field holds, preventing the intrusion from altering our course. This requires a constant, conscious effort to reinforce internal directives against external pressures, maintaining a stable trajectory regardless of the crosswinds. The third layer is the zero-trust model applied inward. This is a radical departure from default receptivity. No external input is trusted by default. Every piece of information, every narrative, every emotional state presented by the external world must earn its passage. This is not cynicism, it is calculated discernment. It forces a rigorous self-inquiry before any external datum is permitted to influence thought or action. It asks, does this resonate with truth, utility, and my core purpose? Or is it merely another attempt at external command, another gravitational well seeking to exert its pull? The operational outcome of a fully implemented interdiction protocol is a state of unassailable autonomy. It is not isolation, but rather an impenetrable clarity of purpose and being. The inner citadel functions optimally, its core systems uncorrupted, regardless of the turbulence of the external environment. This creates a psychological and cognitive robustness that allows for peak performance under any external load. This hardened internal state, this disciplined filtering of reality, is the ultimate expression of inner freedom. It is the complete liberation from the phantom leash of perceived constraint, as only self-sanctioned influences are permitted to enter the cognitive domain. It is the full actualization of the immutable core, protected and preserved against all incursions. With the interdiction protocol firmly in place, the groundwork is laid for the next crucial stage, the force multiplier. This fortified internal territory, resilient and unyielding, becomes the launch pad for converging intent and action with amplified effect. The self, having established its operational boundaries, is now ready to project its will with unparalleled precision and power. The constant vigilance, the rigorous filtering, the disciplined rejection of noise, these are not burdens, but the very mechanisms that ensure the integrity required for a truly impactful existence. The inner citadel stands, not merely as a sanctuary, but as a command center, secured and ready for its next deployment. Chapter 9. Force, Multiplier, Converging, Intent, and Action. The arc of internal fortification, meticulously constructed through rigorous self-interdiction and volitional programming, culminates now in its externalized projection. Your inner architecture, forged in the crucible of sovereign command, is not an end in itself. It is the core reactor. Its purpose, to power a specific output, to manifest intent into an objective reality. This is the domain of the force multiplier, the convergence of intent and action, transforming potentiality into kinetic efficacy. The distinction between desire and deed is a chasm where many fall. Ambition, uncalibrated, disperses as thermal energy, yielding no work. Thought, uncoupled from its executive vector, remains a latent potential, an unaccessed data block. The challenge, then, is not merely to formulate intent, but to engineer its transition across the threshold of materialization with absolute fidelity. This transfer function must operate with minimal signal degradation, maximizing the yield from internal impulse to external consequence. Consider the precision required in a high-frequency trading algorithm. Its internal logic, its intent to exploit a market anomaly, must translate into instantaneous, perfectly timed buy or sell orders. Any latency, any interpretive error between the program decision and its execution in milliseconds renders the entire endeavor inert. The profit window vanishes. The system, though intellectually sound, is operationally defunct. Its internal sophistication means nothing if its output vector is misaligned or attenuated. This convergence is not optional, it is the sine qua non of utility. The critical juncture, the intent-action crossover, is where abstract mental constructs undergo a phase transition into tangible physical or strategic operations. It is the moment the internal model of reality, refined and fortified, asserts itself upon the external continuum. This is not a passive process of observation. It is an active, directed emission. Every fiber of a pilot's being, upon recognizing a critical system failure, must channel through the neural architecture of preemptive surrender, not to the crisis, but to the programmed response. The intent to stabilize, to correct, to survive must translate without a single extraneous thought or motion into the precise sequence of controls. The intellectual comprehension of the emergency is merely the input. The output is the immediate, unhesitating, and correct physical manipulation of the aircraft systems. This frictionless transfer from cognition to kinetics defines survival. Calibration is paramount. Intent, like a laser targeting system, must be focused to a single coherent point. Its energy, if diffused, fails to penetrate. An overarching objective must decompose into a sequence of micro-intents, each precisely defined, each interlocking with the next like gears in a high-tolerance mechanism. The initial grand design, however visionary, is useless if the internal calculation of the target's trajectory is off by a micron. The beam's physical manifestation, its action, becomes a wasteful scatter. This requires a relentless reduction of ambiguity, an operationalizing of every parameter. What is the objective? What are the constraints? What resources are available? What is the irreducible next step? These are not questions for contemplation. They are input parameters for the volitional algorithm. The operational terrain is inherently subject to translational entropy. The conversion process from internal will to external deed inevitably encounters friction, resistance, and the degradation of coherence. This is the friction coefficient of execution. A complex manufacturing process initiated with a meticulously engineered design, the intent, will fail to yield optimal output if there is any deviation in the initial specification. A minor flaw in a CAD file translates into cascading errors on the factory floor, leading to material waste, production delays, and a product that falls short of its intended performance envelope. The potential for the system to perform as designed is squandered not by a lack of effort, but by a lack of fidelity in the translation process. The interdiction protocols previously discussed, applied to the inner citadel, serve precisely this function: to minimize internal noise and psychological resistance, thereby reducing the systemic entropy of action. A clear mind, unburdened by self-doubt or external distraction, is a clean channel for intent. When intent and action achieve perfect alignment, the effect is not additive, it is multiplicative. This is the core principle of the force multiplier. The output far exceeds the sum of the individual inputs. Consider a small, specialized combat unit. Individually, their skills are formidable. But when perfectly synchronized, operating with a single, clear objective, their combined actions create a strategic advantage disproportionate to their numerical strength. They become a single coherent entity, leveraging every movement, every shot, every communication to achieve an effect that a larger, less coordinated force could not. This leverage is born from an absolute understanding of the objective, the intent, and an unyielding, precise execution of the necessary maneuvers, the action. The whole becomes exponentially greater than its parts, not merely through synergy, but through a phase-locked coherence of will and deed. This capability to project a coherent vector of command is not theoretical, it is operational. The deep space antenna array, for instance, must receive signals so faint they are merely whispers against the cosmic background noise. Its ability to achieve this relies entirely on the absolute suppression of internal electronic interference. Every component, every circuit, every environmental parameter must be controlled to prevent the degradation of the incoming data stream. Similarly, the individual seeking to project their will upon the world must suppress the internal static of indecision, fear, and distraction to allow their intent to propagate clearly and effectively. This internal discipline is the foundation of external command. The consequences of failing to converge intent and action are not merely theoretical. They are often catastrophic. Consider the scenario of a deep submergence rescue operation. At 300 meters below the ocean surface, a critical subsea manifold has ruptured, trapping a maintenance crew in a flooded chamber. The rescue submersible, a highly specialized vehicle designed for extreme pressure and precision maneuvering, is dispatched. Its mission parameters are stark: locate the rupture, effect a temporary seal, and extract the personnel before the chamber's structural integrity is compromised by cascading failures. Time is a finite, rapidly diminishing resource. The lead operator of the rescue submersible, a veteran of countless high-pressure deployments, receives the initial telemetry. His internal intent is crystal clear: retrieve the trapped crew. But this singular intent must immediately decompose into hundreds of calibrated sub-intents, assessing the integrity of the rescue vehicle itself, calculating pressure differentials, plotting a precise descent trajectory through treacherous currents, managing complex robotic manipulators, and maintaining uninterrupted communication with the surface command. Every decision, every fractional movement of the control stick, every adjustment to the ballast tanks is an action, and each action must be an uncorrupted translation of the overarching will. As the submersible descends, a cascade of environmental and mechanical anomalies begins. A primary thruster experiences an unexpected power fluctuation, threatening to throw the vehicle off course. The external sonar array registers anomalous reflections, indicating unanticipated geological formations or debris fields. Communication with the surface becomes intermittent, compressed by the immense hydrostatic pressure. Each of these events presents a potential for translational entropy, for the pure intent to be fragmented by unexpected friction and resistance. Here, the interdiction protocols previously established become critical. The operator's inner citadel remains unbreached by panic or indecision. The neural architecture, programmed for preemptive surrender to procedure, filters out the static of emotional response. His volitional algorithm processes the new data streams with icy precision, immediately recalibrating the micro-intents. The thruster issue is isolated and compensation vectors are applied. The sonar anomalies are cross-referenced with preloaded bathymetric maps, allowing for immediate course correction. The intermittent communication is managed through pre-established protocols for data compression and redundancy. The true force multiplier effect manifests in the operator's ability to maintain a perfectly phase-locked coherence between his core intent, the rescue, and the ceaseless minute actions required to navigate the crisis. He does not merely react, he orchestrates. Each lever pulled, each switch toggled, each command issued to the robotic arm is a precise, deliberate projection of his will. The vehicle, an extension of his nervous system, becomes a single, highly efficient effector in a hostile environment. The physical constraints, the technical failures, the psychological pressure, these are not external commands but parameters within his operational calculus. Through this unwavering convergence, the vehicle reaches the manifold. The robotic arms, guided by the operator's minute adjustments, meticulously clear the debris and secure the temporary seal, preventing further ingress of water. The crew, disoriented but alive, is extracted. The ascent is as fraught as the descent, yet every action, every response to the shifting ocean is a direct, uncorrupted extension of the singular intent. This is the tangible reality of the force multiplier. Not a mystical concept, but a rigorous operational principle. The internal discipline, the clarity of will, the systematic processing of data, and the precise, unhesitating projection of action. These elements, when fused into a coherent vector, transcend mere capability. They unlock a disproportionate efficacy, transforming daunting challenges into solvable equations and potential into undeniable reality. The mastery of this convergence is the ultimate determinant of impact in any domain. It is the signature of true command. Chapter 10. The zero-point equilibrium, a state beyond volatility. The journey has traversed the intricate architecture of external compulsion. It has mapped the neural pathways of capitulation. We have dissected the phantom leash, calibrated the cognitive aperture, and fortified the inner citadel. We have converged intent with action. These are not disparate exercises. They are sequential phases in the engineering of a singular, profound state. This state, the zero-point equilibrium, represents a fundamental shift. It is the cessation of reactive oscillation. It is the transcendence of mere resilience. Resilience implies absorption and rebound. Equilibrium signifies an intrinsic, unperturbed ground state. Consider the quantum field. Even at absolute zero, a residual energy persists. This is zero-point energy. It is not inertness. It is the foundational, irreducible vibrational frequency of the vacuum itself, a state of maximal potential yet minimal fluctuation. Your inner landscape can achieve an analogous condition, not empty, but operating at its fundamental, most stable resonance. A domain impervious to the thermodynamic turbulence of the external world. This resonance is not merely a metaphor, it is a metaphysical declaration of your irreducible self. Below the strata of learned behavior and conditioned response lies this core frequency, an echoing truth of being. To access it, one must strip away the accretions, the distortions, and the parasitic signals that cloud the primal broadcast of your own existence. This is the ultimate deconstruction, revealing the irreducible, uncreated self that precedes all experience and all reaction. It is the core of what you are before the world tells you what you should be. We are not discussing a transient meditative pause, nor a forced stoicism. This is a baseline calibration. It is the operational standard for a mind that has transcended the need for constant course correction. It is the establishment of an ontological certainty. Your existence typically manifests as a series of reactions, a dynamic feedback loop with external stimuli. You are buffeted, you adjust, you recalibrate. This continuous expenditure of psychic energy is unsustainable. It degrades performance. It erodes resolve. The zero-point equilibrium is the system reaching critical damping. It absorbs perturbation not by rigid resistance, but by an inherent balanced stability that nullifies the impulse to oscillate. This critical damping is a stoic imperative, an internal gyroscopic stabilization against the winds of fortune. It mandates that the rational faculty, the hegemonicon, retains its uncompromised sovereignty, permitting no external event to dictate its internal disposition. The world may surge, but the inner compass remains fixed, pointing to the true north of reason and virtue. The initial steps involved identifying the gravitational wells, those external commands exerting insidious pull. You learned to discern the phantom leashes, the perceived constraints that bind only by consent. These were acts of deconstruction. Now, the emphasis shifts to intrinsic construction, building a self that simply is, rather than one that reacts. This inherent isness is the philosophical bedrock upon which zero-point equilibrium stands. It posits a self not as a collection of attributes or roles, but as a pure, unconditioned presence. This is the self that exists prior to categorization, prior to the demands of identity, prior to the ceaseless external evaluation. It is the silent observer, the still point, the unmoving center from which all conscious experience emanates. The unbinding equation was a protocol for detachment. The Interdiction protocol, a defensive perimeter. The zero-point equilibrium represents the full integration of these prior protocols. It is when the inner citadel becomes not merely fortified, but inherently unassailable because its core operating frequency no longer resonates with external chaos. It is the systemic actualization of internal freedom, a freedom born not of external circumstance, but of an absolute volitional decree. This state is not granted, it is claimed. It is the declaration of self as the ultimate authority over one's internal landscape, a metaphysical secession from the tyranny of accident and externality. It is the establishment of an inertial reference frame within your own consciousness. In physics, an inertial frame is one where an object at rest remains at rest, and an object in motion continues in motion with constant velocity unless acted upon by a net force. Imagine your consciousness as such a frame, unmoving amidst the maelstrom, unaccelerated by external pressures. Your decisions, your actions, originate from this stable, unaccelerated platform. This internal reference point is the philosophical anchor. It establishes a consistent metric for truth and value, independent of fluctuating popular opinion or prevailing emotional tides. It means your actions are not reactions, but emanations from a fixed, reasoned source. This is the prohairesis in its purest form, the rational faculty, fully actualized, serving as the immutable arbiter of choice and judgment beyond the reach of external compulsion. This is not a passive surrender to fate. It is an active engineering of an internal environment so robust, so fundamentally aligned that external volatility registers as mere background noise. Like a precision instrument operating in a soundproof, vibration-isolated chamber. The instrument performs its function flawlessly, irrespective of the cacophony outside. Your core self becomes that instrument. This engineering is the applied metaphysics of personal sovereignty. It acknowledges that while external events may be indifferent to your will, your internal response is your absolute domain. To curate this domain with surgical precision, to eliminate dissonance and enforce congruence between your deepest principles and your moment-to-moment existence, is the ultimate act of self-authorship. It is to manifest the ideal self not as an aspiration, but as an operational reality. The pursuit of this equilibrium demands a rigorous adherence to the principles previously outlined. It requires an unwavering commitment to the immutable core, a relentless application of the volitional algorithm. It is the continuous practice of seeing clearly through the cognitive aperture, free from distortion. This immutable core is the essence of your rational being, your connection to the universal logos. It is the uncorrupted spark of divinity within, that which aligns you with cosmic reason. To commit to it unwaveringly is to choose alignment with truth over comfort, with virtue over fleeting pleasure. The volitional algorithm, therefore, is not merely a mechanism of choice, but a perpetual recalibration of the self against this transcendent standard. When you operate from zero-point equilibrium, your internal state ceases to be a variable dependent on external inputs. It becomes an independent constant. This is the profound reorientation of your being. No longer do fluctuations in the market, the opinions of others, or the vagaries of circumstance dictate your emotional or strategic trajectory. They are observed, processed, but they do not define your internal baseline. This independence is the hallmark of the sage, a mind that has achieved freedom from external dictation. It is the recognition that while you exist within the world, you are not of the world in your essential nature. Your worth, your direction, your very being are self-derived, self-validated, and internally sustained. This state is a force multiplier of a different order. Chapter 9 explored the convergence of intent and action. The zero-point equilibrium provides the stable power source for that convergence. It ensures that your intent is pure, undistorted by fear or desire, and that your actions flow with maximal efficiency, unburdened by internal friction or doubt. This stability underpins the entire edifice of effective execution. Without it, intent, however noble, devolves into mere aspiration. Action, however energetic, becomes chaotic and ultimately inefficient. Zero-point equilibrium transmutes potential into actualization, ensuring a clean, unimpeded channel from the conceptual to the manifest. Think of a telecommunications network operating at optimal signal-to-noise ratio. The message is clear, distortion is minimal. The zero-point equilibrium reduces the internal noise, the chatter of anxiety, the pull of external validation, the echoes of past failures, to a negligible threshold. What remains is pure signal, unadulterated purpose, clear perception, precise execution. This internal clarity is the metaphysical prerequisite for true wisdom. It allows the mind to perceive reality unvarnished, free from the subjective overlays of personal bias or emotional entanglement. It is the eye of the soul, seeing through the mire of transient appearances to the underlying structure of reality. This is not emotional repression, it is emotional sovereignty. Emotions are acknowledged. They are data points. They are not commanding officers. The equilibrium ensures they flow through the system without generating resonance that destabilizes the core. Joy, sorrow, anger, fear, they are registered, understood, and then allowed to dissipate, rather than accumulate as energetic debt. This sovereignty is an active, volitional act. It is the stoic discipline of assent applied to the internal landscape. You do not deny the existence of a feeling, but you deny it the power to compel your judgment or your action. They become transient phenomena, like clouds passing across the sky of your consciousness, observed but not allowed to obscure the sun of your reason. Attaining this state requires a fundamental shift in reference point. The external world, with its incessant demands and fleeting rewards, ceases to be the primary arbiter of your worth or your direction. The internal standard takes precedence. Your self-validation becomes the ultimate, uncompromised metric, calibrated against universal principles, not against the fleeting whims of culture or society. It is a profound declaration of self-possession, a refusal to outsource your ontological security to external variables. The Stoic principle that virtue is the only good, and all else, adiaphora, indifferent, finds its operational actualization here. This necessitates an active disengagement from the performance theater of societal expectation. It is a radical embrace of your own internal compass, calibrated against universal principles rather than prevailing trends. The mind, when operating at 0 point, maintains true north regardless of the yaw and pitch of the external environment. This disengagement is not a retreat, but an advance into authenticity. It is the courage to stand alone in your convictions, to measure your success by an internal ledger, not by external applause. It is the profound realization that external validation is a volatile currency, whereas self-validation, rooted in virtue and reason, is an immutable internal capital. The implications for leadership are profound. A leader operating from 0 point equilibrium does not react to panic. They do not succumb to hype. Their decisions are not dictated by the emotional contagion of the crowd, but by a detached, clear-eyed assessment from an unshakable internal position. This generates trust. It cultivates certainty. It provides an anchor for others caught in volatility. Such a leader embodies the ideal of the philosopher king, not in political office, but in the realm of influence. They project a calm competence that is not feigned, but an organic outgrowth of their internal congruence. Their presence alone can stabilize a turbulent environment, because their internal state broadcasts an undeniable frequency of composure. The disciplined mind, through sustained practice, gradually sheds layers of conditional programming. The neural architectures of preemptive surrender are dismantled. The phantom leashes dissolve into non-existence. What emerges is not merely resilience, but an intrinsic, fundamental stability. This shedding of conditioning is a spiritual purification, a stripping away of the inauthentic. It is the philosophical journey of becoming truly free, not from external constraints, but from the internal chains forged by unexamined beliefs and automatic reactions. This is the rigorous self-mastery that allows one to perceive and act from a position of unburdened clarity. Consider the precision mechanics of a satellite maintaining orbital stability. It constantly adjusts, yes, but its core trajectory is fixed, calculated and immune to minor atmospheric perturbations. It possesses an inherent stability that allows for nuanced adjustments without losing its fundamental trajectory. Your inner state achieves a similar dynamic equilibrium. This equilibrium is not static. It is a dynamic process of perpetual alignment, a continuous attunement to your core principles amidst the ever-shifting external field. It is the active maintenance of coherence, ensuring that minor deviations are corrected before they can destabilize the overarching mission. The achievement of 0 point is not a destination. It is an operational mode. It is a continuous calibration. The external world will relentlessly introduce variables. The discipline is to integrate these variables without allowing them to perturb the internal baseline. It is to remain the calm center, even when the periphery is in turmoil. This operational mode is the applied metaphysics of constant vigilance, a commitment to perpetual self-assessment and realignment. It recognizes that mastery is not a state achieved, but a state continuously upheld, a volitional act of recommitting to your chosen trajectory with every encountered challenge. This internal stillness is not idleness. It is the fertile ground from which decisive action springs. From a place of profound inner calm, choices are made with surgical precision. Energy, no longer dissipated in reactive cycles, is conserved and channeled directly into intentional creation and execution. This stillness is the wellspring of true power, the quiet before the storm of intentional directed action. It is the Stoic understanding that true effectiveness does not arise from frenetic activity, but from considered, purposeful engagement rooted in an unshakable inner core. The state beyond volatility is a state of robust, intrinsic self-governance. It is the pinnacle of individual agency. It means that your power source, your internal generator, is always running at optimal efficiency, independent of external grid fluctuations. It is a self-sustaining system. This self-governance is the ultimate realization of autonomy, a declaration of independence from all external dependencies for your peace and purpose. It is the recognition that the fundamental source of your strength resides entirely within, an inexhaustible spring that no external force can deplete or compromise. The path to this equilibrium is not a linear ascent. It is a recursive refinement. Each challenge overcome, each external anchor disengaged, each internal protocol implemented contributes to the calibration. The mind becomes more precise, less prone to error, more capable of returning to its baseline with accelerated efficiency. This recursive refinement is the Stoic practice of constant self-improvement, the daily examination of conscience, the perpetual honing of judgment. It is the unwavering commitment to an ideal, knowing that while perfection may be unattainable, relentless progress towards it is the essence of a life well lived. This is the ultimate self-mastery, to become the unmoving center of your own universe, to be the fixed point of reference against which all external phenomena are measured, yet from which nothing can dislodge you. This is the zero-point equilibrium. It is the foundation for constructing a reality of unyielding strength. It is the prerequisite for command. It is the metaphysical truth of your inherent power, a power that, once fully recognized and actualized, renders you truly indomitable. Chapter 11. The Crystalline Structure, Building a Resilient Reality. The zero-point equilibrium once attained is not an endpoint of stasis, but the quiescent substrate, the absolute vacuum from which all coherent construction must initiate. It grants the profound stillness, the unassailable calm essential for precise operation. Yet, stillness alone, while a powerful shield, is not a generative force. It is the canvas, not the masterpiece. From this state of pre-volitional repose, the imperative shifts to manifest an ordered existence, an architected reality whose resilience transcends mere reaction. This is the genesis of the crystalline structure. Conceive of your lived experience not as an amorphous field, perpetually susceptible to every passing external force, but as a robust, complex lattice. This is an architecture forged from discrete yet intricately interconnected elements, each precisely positioned, each contributing demonstrably to the macroscopic integrity of the whole. This structure is not a gratuity, it is engineered. It is not discovered, it is synthesized. Its defining characteristic is its resistance to entropic decay, its capacity to absorb, channel, and dissipate exogenous pressures without compromising its fundamental internal order. The raw material for this structure is the converged intent and action, the disciplined volition that Chapter 9 illuminated with such clarity. The binding forces are the immutable core principles articulated in Chapter 5, acting as the energetic fields holding the molecular bonds. The energetic substrate that sustains its existence, preventing vibrational fragmentation, is the zero-point equilibrium itself. Without that profound inner silence, the structural integrity would be compromised by resonant noise, prone to sympathetic vibrational collapse under minimal duress. Consider the advanced metallurgy of superalloys, engineered to operate under the most extreme temperatures and pressures encountered in aerospace or nuclear fission. Their extraordinary strength derives not from mere material mass, but from a precise atomic arrangement, a highly ordered crystalline lattice where dislocations are minimized or strategically managed, often through grain boundary engineering. Your reality, when transmuted into a crystalline state, operates on an analogous principle. Its robustness is a direct function of internal coherence, a pre-programmed defiance against the arbitrary flux of the external environment. Every deliberate choice, every disciplined exclusion, every affirmative assertion of your autonomous will serves as an atomic deposition within this evolving structure. Envision the meticulous growth of a synthetic diamond. Atom by atom, under conditions of intense pressure and meticulously controlled temperature, carbon units arrange themselves into an unyielding, symmetrical matrix. Your life, your entire field of experience, can be subjected to this same rigorous process of self-assembly. It demands a deliberate, sustained energy input, a consistent application of the architect's will. This is not a passive process of observation. It is an active, ongoing crystallization. The forces of external command, the phantom leashes of perceived constraint, the chaotic fluctuations of the market or social spheres, these represent various forms of chaotic energy input. An amorphous self disperses under such forces, losing definition, collapsing into a lower state of order and increased vulnerability. A crystalline self, however, possesses the inherent architecture to reorient, to channel these energetic disturbances, or simply to absorb them, its integrity maintained by its indomitable internal structure. The initial nucleation site for this crystalline reality is the irreducible self, the daimon of ancient wisdom. It is the core identity, defined not by transient external validation or ephemeral societal trends, but by internally coherent values and immutable principles. From this central node, growth propagates outwards. Each principle acts as a nodal point in the lattice, each value as a precise bond angle, dictating the exact geometry of your engagement with the world. Deviations from this internal symmetry are not merely errors, they are structural defects, points of potential fracture within the nascent crystal. Rigorous adherence ensures seamless, uncompromised integration. Your volitional algorithm, extensively refined in Chapter 7, becomes the instruction set for this highly ordered growth. It dictates precisely where energetic resources are directed, which external inputs are admitted into your operational field, and which are summarily rejected. It ensures that every action, every decision aligns with the inherent symmetry and high-order periodicity of your core principles. This is the internal phase-locking mechanism, preventing vibrational drift and ensuring systemic coherence. The resilient reality forged in this manner manifests as a field of exceptional signal integrity. In a world perpetually saturated with informational noise, where conflicting imperatives generate perpetual static and cognitive dissonance, your crystalline structure functions as an advanced filter. It allows only those frequencies, those informational packets, those energetic transmissions congruent with its internal resonance to propagate meaningfully within your defined operating parameters. Dissonant frequencies are not merely ignored, they are actively absorbed, attenuated, or simply passed through without inducing any disruptive sympathetic vibration, much like a precisely tuned radio frequency identification (RFID) antenna rejects all but its designated carrier wave. This self-filtering mechanism is not an act of willful ignorance, but of optimized intelligent processing. You do not deny the existence of external realities. You deny their inherent capacity to fundamentally disrupt your meticulously architected internal structure. The cognitive aperture, once a passive wideband receiver, becomes an active discriminator, selectively admitting only that data which contributes to your structural maintenance, growth, and overall systemic optimization. Consider the concept of phase transitions in condensed matter physics. A substance can exist in multiple macroscopic states, liquid, gaseous, solid, each possessing distinctly different properties and energy levels. The amorphous self exists in a fluid, easily deformable state, highly reactive to every thermal fluctuation and external perturbation. The crystalline self represents a profound, irreversible phase transition to a solid, ordered state. This transition requires significant sustained energy input, the relentless application of conscious effort, disciplined thought, and rigorous self-governance. Once this phase transition occurs, the system exhibits entirely new, emergent properties, dramatically enhanced strength, predictable and reliable behavior, and an inherent self-sustaining stability. The crystalline structure allows for an unprecedented level of fault tolerance. In any complex system, disruptions are not anomalies, they are statistical certainties. External events, a significant market downturn, a profound personal setback, an unexpected operational challenge, can exert immense, transient pressure. An amorphous system collapses under such load, dissipating its energy in disorder. A crystalline one, by contrast, bends, intelligently distributes the load across its robust lattice, and returns to its original configuration, often strengthened by the transient stress. This resilience stems from a deliberate redundancy in principle and an uncompromising robustness in execution. If one facet of your engineered reality is critically stressed, the inherent interconnectedness of your principles ensures that the load is immediately distributed across the entire lattice. There is no single point of catastrophic failure. This is the engineering of personal anti-fragility, built into the very molecular fabric of your existence. To cultivate and maintain this structure, you must become a master alchemist of your own internal elements. The base metals of fear, doubt, and reliance on external validation must be transmuted into the noble elements of conviction, self-trust, and internal validation. This alchemical transmutation occurs under the immense internal pressure generated by consistent self-discipline and unyielding adherence to your code. It demands a constant, almost diagnostic evaluation of your structural integrity. Are there areas of compromise, regions where the lattice is irregular or weakened? Are certain decisions inadvertently introducing impurities or dislocations into the crystalline structure? Are your actions consistently aligned with the high-order symmetry of your declared values? Any deviation, however seemingly minor, introduces a defect that, if unaddressed, can propagate, creating cleavage planes and ultimately weakening the entire construct. The manifestation of this crystalline reality is not merely abstract. It is profoundly, tangibly practical. It dictates the inviolable quality of your relationships, elevating them from transactional to resonant. It defines the unswerving trajectory of your professional endeavors, ensuring maximum leverage of effort. It underpins the profound serenity of your inner landscape, irrespective of external turbulence. When your reality possesses crystalline order, your interactions with the world become precise, impactful, and devoid of the friction inherent in an unordered, chaotic existence. Your decision-making processes become demonstrably faster, cleaner, more efficient. With a rigorously defined internal structure, the permissible range of acceptable outcomes narrows dramatically, and the optimal path forward illuminates with an almost predictive clarity. The cognitive noise of conflicting options is suppressed. The optimal vector becomes evident, an inevitable consequence of your superior internal architecture. This structured existence is not rigid in the sense of being unresponsive or ossified. A precisely cut crystal can be utilized for specific, highly sensitive functions, from laser generation to telecommunication filters. Its rigidity refers to its internal coherence and resistance to dissolution, not its inability to interact. In fact, its structural integrity is precisely what enables it to interact with the world with maximum effect and minimal self-distortion. It becomes a translucent medium through which higher-order intentions can propagate, a precise instrument for conscious creation and influence. The cultivation of this resilient reality also involves a dynamic, intelligent interaction with its boundaries. The outer perimeter of your crystalline structure defines, with absolute precision, what you permit to enter your operational field and what you repel. This is an active, energetic process, not a passive barrier. Just as a crystal lattice exerts a specific electromagnetic field, your coherent internal state projects an energetic signature that subtly yet powerfully influences your environment. It does not control others, but it establishes an immutable energetic boundary that filters interactions and magnetically attracts resonance. This is the metaphysical equivalent of a carefully engineered material possessing specific dielectric properties, selectively allowing or blocking energy transmission. Your internal state becomes the dielectric medium of your personal field, meticulously dictating its permeability to external influences and ensuring signal fidelity. The crystalline structure is inherently self-organizing once the initial parameters are established and rigorously maintained. It exhibits emergent properties that consistently surpass the mere sum of its individual components. A single atom of carbon possesses limited utility. Arranged in a diamond lattice, it becomes a substance of unparalleled hardness, brilliance, and value. Similarly, individual acts of discipline, when consistently applied and coherently integrated, generate a life of profound resilience, strategic impact, and extraordinary purpose. This is not a final destination, a static achievement. It is a state of continuous becoming, a dynamic equilibrium within a universe of perpetual energy flux. To maintain crystalline integrity within such a field demands unceasing vigilance. It requires continuous recalibration, rigorous stress testing against novel challenges, and ongoing atomic refinement. New pressures emerge from the environment. Old weaknesses, perhaps long dormant, may resurface. The crystalline architect remains perpetually engaged in reinforcing, expanding, and optimizing the edifice. Your every deliberate action becomes the mechanism by which this structure grows and is further refined. Each instance of disciplined choice acts as a microcrystallization event, adding another layer, enhancing the density, symmetry, and overall coherence of the whole. This is the relentless, silent, and often unglamorous work of self-mastery. It is the fundamental, uncompromising engineering that underpins a life impervious to external caprice, a life where the internal architect reigns supreme. The ultimate implication of forging this crystalline reality is the profound transition from a life reactive to entropy, to a life actively shaping its own field of encounter. It is a declaration of autonomy, not as an escape from reality, but as a deliberate, purposeful engagement with it on one's own terms, from an unassailable position of profound, structured strength. You cease to be a passive data point in a chaotic system, and become instead an ordered, self-contained system capable of imprinting coherence upon its environment. This is the resilient reality, a living, breathing testament to the architect's unyielding mandate. Chapter 12. The Architect's Mandate, Commanding the Field of Potential. The crystalline structure, meticulously forged, provides an unyielding architecture, yet its ultimate purpose transcends mere resilience. It functions as the crucible, the hardened computational substrate from which the next phase of existential engagement initiates. We shift now from defense and consolidation to the active prosecution of potential itself. Consider the field of potential not as a mere collection of latent opportunities, but as a dynamic quantum manifold, a pre-geometric substrate of uncollapsed probabilities. Within this manifold, all unmanifested futures exist in a state of superposition, awaiting the decisive interaction, the conscious observation, the volitional impulse that collapses the wave function into experiential reality. This is not abstraction, it is the fundamental operating principle of creation. This field is the raw, undifferentiated data stream of the universe prior to its compression into perceived events. It is the pure, unconditioned capacity for being. The architect's mandate is the conscious assumption of agency within this probabilistic domain. It is the directive to move beyond passive observation or reactive response, to become the primary causal agent. This requires an understanding that every thought, every intent, every meticulously engineered action functions as an energetic vector, a directed force of information entering the field, influencing its entropic flow and biasing the collapse of potential towards a specified outcome. The individual is not merely a recipient of reality, but an active compiler of its source code. This active command is not an act of brute force against an indifferent cosmos, but a sophisticated process of resonant alignment and precise signal injection. The immutable core, calibrated to 0-point equilibrium, becomes a stable frequency emitter. Its signal, clean and uncorrupted by internal chaos or external dissonance, propagates into the field, interacting with the nascent probability states. This is a form of information pre-processing, shaping the raw data of potential before it solidifies into perceptible phenomena. The fidelity of this signal determines the integrity of the emergent reality. The precision of this command hinges on the absolute clarity of the volitional algorithm. A fragmented intent, riddled with internal contradictions or resonant frequencies of doubt, acts as noise in the system. It dilutes the signal, leading to indeterminate collapses, a chaotic superposition manifesting as undesired or irrelevant outcomes. Therefore, the internal state must be a harmonized oscillator, a coherent laser of purpose. This demands an unwavering commitment to a singular defined objective, devoid of secondary agendas or conflicting desires that introduce logical errors into the command sequence. The cognitive aperture, previously discussed as the filter of perception, here functions as the focusing lens for intent. It directs the energetic vector with pinpoint accuracy into the desired region of the probabilistic manifold. Concurrently, the interdiction protocol operates not solely for internal defense, but for external calibration, preventing the entrainment of one's energetic signature by extraneous, discordant frequencies from the collective subconscious or the chaotic external environment. This ensures that the injected command signal remains uncorrupted by interference, maintaining its directional integrity and power. We are not merely predicting, we are programming. The future is not a fixed construct to be discovered, but a dynamic, malleable computational space. The architect identifies target states, defines the requisite parameters, and then initiates a sequential series of strategic interventions. These interventions are not random probes, but calculated injections of energy and information designed to steer the system along a desired trajectory. This is a form of preemptive engineering, where the variables of tomorrow are influenced by the deliberate, disciplined actions of today. This approach acknowledges the universe as a probabilistic system, not a purely deterministic one. Command over the field of potential is not about enforcing a singular, absolute outcome on every microscopic variable, which remains an illusion. Instead, it is about the statistical steering of macroscopic probabilities. Consider a particle accelerator. You cannot dictate the exact trajectory of every individual subatomic particle, but by precisely calibrating the electromagnetic fields, you can steer the beam of particles collectively towards a desired target with incredibly high probability. The architect's mandate operates on a similar principle, influencing the energetic landscape such that the most probable outcome aligns with the intended future state, effectively collapsing the most favorable wave function. The feedback loops are critical for maintaining the integrity of this process. The manifestation of reality provides empirical data, not merely about external events, but about the integrity and precision of your internal command protocols. A deviation from the desired outcome is not a failure of the field, but a signal that your internal calibration requires adjustment. It indicates a misalignment between your volitional algorithm and the fundamental constants of the field. This iterative process of intent, action, observation, recalibration is the engine of continuous architectural refinement. It is the intellectual rigor of an engineer, stress-testing a new design, identifying vulnerabilities, and iteratively optimizing for peak performance. The unbinding equation, once applied, releases the cognitive resources previously tethered to external anchors. These liberated resources are then revectorized, serving as the computational power behind the architect's mandate. It is a reallocation of processing capacity, shifting from reactive problem-solving to proactive future state generation. This is the difference between debugging an existing system and designing an entirely new one from first principles, utilizing every available resource for the construction of a new reality. The architect understands that command over the field of potential is a function of information asymmetry. The more deeply one comprehends the underlying algorithms of reality, the fundamental constants and variable interactions that govern its operation, the greater one's capacity to predict and influence its emergent properties. This is not about acquiring more data, but about discerning the axiomatic truths that govern the flow of causality, much like a master cryptographer discerns the key within a seemingly random stream of characters. It is the ability to read the universe's own instruction manual and apply its principles. The manifestation of command is not instantaneous, but cumulative. Each deliberate action, each focused intention, adds a quantum of energy to the desired probability well, increasing its gravitational pull. Over time, as these intentional vectors accumulate and align, the probability of the target state collapses towards certainty. This is the patient, persistent application of force multiplier principles to the very fabric of existence. It is the disciplined amplification of subtle influences until they achieve macroscopic, undeniable effect, much like the slow, inexorable build-up of tectonic pressure culminating in a seismic event. The integrity of this entire process is maintained by the crystalline structure, which acts as a robust containment field for one's intent. Without this internal coherence, the energy vectors disperse, the signal attenuates, and the command becomes diffuse, yielding only indeterminate noise. The structure ensures that the energetic output is focused, directional, and impervious to lateral interference, providing the necessary rigidity for the controlled expansion of one's influence and the precise shaping of potential. In the mid-21st century, the critical infrastructure governing global water distribution faced unprecedented strain. Decades of unmanaged resource depletion, coupled with erratic climate patterns, had pushed existing systems to a breaking point. Predictive models based on current trajectory analyses indicated a cascading failure within 3 fiscal quarters, leading to societal collapse across vulnerable regions. The conventional approach dictated a reactive scramble for emergency appropriations, temporary diversions, and political appeasement. It was a strategy of entropy management characterized by a desperate attempt to mitigate an accelerating decline, not to reverse it. This represented a collective surrender to the perceived inevitability of scarcity. A new consortium, comprising minds honed in the principles of anticipatory engineering and deep systems design, approached the crisis from the architect's mandate. They rejected the immediate problem statement, how to mitigate impending scarcity, and instead focused on how to design and actualize a future state of water abundance and equitable distribution. This was not optimism. It was a redefinition of the field of potential itself, moving beyond the observed constraints to the underlying, unmanifested possibilities. Their immutable core was fixed on a reality where water was not a diminishing resource, but an accessible, managed utility. Their initial phase involved deep systems analysis, not of current infrastructure failures, but of the fundamental hydrological cycles and unexploited energy potentials. They identified vast, neglected geological aquifers deemed inaccessible, nascent desalination technologies previously dismissed as economically infeasible by prevailing market metrics, and sophisticated atmospheric water harvesting methods deemed fringe science by entrenched institutions. Their volitional algorithm was singular and unyielding, absolute regional resource independence, devoid of external dependencies or political vulnerabilities. Rather than react to political pressures, media narratives, or immediate supply chain breakdowns, they systematically initiated parallel development tracks, each a focused information injection into the probabilistic field. One team leveraged advanced quantum annealing processes to recalibrate atmospheric precipitation models, identifying precise energetic signatures to induce controlled rainfall in targeted arid zones. Another engineered hyper-efficient modular desalination plants powered by self-sustaining fusion microreactors, designed for rapid deployment in coastal desert regions, operating entirely off-grid. A third developed subterranean sensor networks, capable of mapping and accessing deep earth aquifers with unprecedented precision, bypassing surface resource volatility. Each strategic investment, each research directive was a deliberate, coherent data packet transmitted into the universe's computational substrate. They did not hope for a solution. They engineered its emergence by biasing the probabilistic manifold. Their approach was methodical, unperturbed by the chaotic signals of external desperation. When conventional political structures ultimately faltered under the escalating crisis, their pre-positioned, fully operational modules were ready. The transition was seamless, appearing almost miraculous to an unprepared world, as if abundance had simply materialized. They had collapsed a desirable future state into reality, not by wishing, but by commanding the pre-geometric substrate through applied intent and meticulously calibrated action. Their crystalline structure, their unwavering zero-point equilibrium, had allowed them to operate with singular focus, untainted by the collective gravitational well of despair. This is the essence of the architect's mandate: to perceive the future not as an inevitability, but as a domain to be consciously constructed. It is the recognition that the present moment is the fulcrum, the point of maximum leverage from which the entire timeline of potential can be influenced. Your internal coherence, your clarity of purpose, your unwavering commitment to a defined outcome, these are the fundamental parameters by which you calibrate the universe. To command the field of potential is to assume your rightful place as the primary engineer of your existential trajectory, shifting from subject to sovereign, from consequence to cause. This is not merely living, it is building reality itself. Conclusion: the unyielding vector. The unyielding vector. We have traversed the deep field arrays of human experience, from the perceived gravity of external command, through the intricate neural mappings of societal programming, to the strategic fortification of the inner citadel itself. You have, by deliberate engagement, recalibrated your core operational parameters. No longer are you a system operating under default constraints, subject to the entropic decay of unexamined influence. You are now the architect. You possess the schematics, the protocols, the precise algorithms to engineer your reality from its fundamental substrates. The phantom leashes, once perceived as immutable tethers, have been analyzed, their energy signatures traced, their illusory power dissolved. You have commanded your cognitive aperture, filtering the observation field, not as a passive receiver, but as an active transducer of meaning. Your immutable core stands, a crystalline structure, impervious to the external chaotic flux. This is the zero-point equilibrium, a state not of passive stasis, but of dynamic stability, the absolute reference frame from which all motion originates and is measured. Your volitional algorithm is now calibrated. Your intent, converged with action, functions as a force multiplier. This is not mere resistance, it is the generation of a new primary impulse. The unyielding vector is not a destination, it is the intrinsic directive of a fully integrated consciousness. It is the unceasing projection of your will, unbent by external noise, uncompromised by transient resistance. It is the relentless, self-sustained trajectory of purpose, forged within, projected outward, immutable, your vector, unyielding. It is the singular command.